Okay, we are live. Let me just wait for Rockfin to give me the green light, and then we will get started. All right. We have with us once again the absolutely great Robert Barnes. Robert, how are you doing? Where can people find you?
Good. Everybody can find any of the content that we put up, including I'll probably pin the hush hush that I did last year around this time on where the Ukrainian conflict might be going. People can evaluate it for themselves as to how accurate it was or wasn't at vivabarneslaw.locals.com.
We have that link in the description box down below. We will pin everything as well as a pinned comment. We'll put all the links as a pinned comment. We have Alexander Mercurus, the Oracle of London, also joining us. Hello to everyone that is watching us on Rockfin, on Odyssey, Rumble. Smash that like if you're watching us on Rumble, on YouTube as well, and of course, theduran.locals.com. Hello to everyone that is watching us on Locals. VJ Cap says, did you see the Viva stream with Konstantin Kissin? Oh my. So
I did not.
It was earlier, wasn't it?
I think it was earlier, so I haven't had the chance to. I'm on Vegas time, so I don't get up early when Viva's doing his 7 a.m., 6 a.m. Viva's an early morning guy, kind of thing. So I haven't seen it. He's I think he was born in Russia, or at least Russian by ancestry, but tends to be an anti-Putin guy. Tends to be a pro-Ukraine war guy. Though he's had some nuance to his opinions. Mostly he's in the cultural space is where a lot of his interest is attracted, but he's reflective and representative of a good topic, which is, why is someone like Jordan Peterson, great psychologist, Camille Paglia has, on the left has said he's one of the great minds of our modern age, a lot of good practical philosophical advice to people on issues of marriage, relationships, as the parody goes, you better clean your room, all that kind of thing. 12, lessons for life. But he's been, whenever he's stepped out of that space, he's been often AWOL. But the most recent version of that is him recommending, welcoming regime change in Iran. And God bless Jordan Peterson, but why do I care about his opinion on Iran anyway? This is someone who got the vaccines wrong early. He said, just shut up and take it. This is someone who, but to give an example, it's how does a very well-intended, very, in my opinion, a very intelligent individual get such issues so wrong on matters of foreign policy? And part of that is the simple explanation that most people judge their a politician or public figure or policy by their lived experience. Otherwise, they rely upon the institutional narrative. My example to friends of mine that are conservative here in America that are obsessively anti-Putin is I'm like, where did you get those ideas from? And to give you an illustration, when I'm talking to them, I say, look at Europe. Europe thinks Donald Trump was the greatest threat to the Western world for war and thinks Joe Biden is a wonderful president, according to their own polls. Why? Because they rely upon the European media for their interpretation of a person they don't know and for events they haven't fully absorbed. The same is true in the U.S. Like the irony is occasionally I'll ask a conservative, like, what would be your ideal government? Would it be something with a balanced budget? Would it be something with like a more of a flatter tax system that's not too, doesn't take a lot, that isn't too progressive, so to speak? Would it be a place that celebrates patriotism and nationalism and pride in your history and heritage? Would it be a place that is more conservative on cultural issues, that doesn't like wokeism? In fact, is so much so that doesn't really even like issues of gender identity and gender fluidity and those constructs is, one of the most conservative countries in the world. And they're like, yeah, that's my ideal kind of leader. That's my ideal kind of country. And I'm like, well, probably the number one example of that in the entire world is Russia under Vladimir Putin, who you claim to hate and despise because they don't even know it. So it's an example of like, which we'll get into in a bit, the broader like Crowder Daily Wire kind of debate, which is the old debate of when do you sacrifice principles to obtain power? And in the process of doing so, do you forfeit any gain that you could use from that power anyway? Look at Peterson. What sources is he trusting? Well, when he started to get into the Ukrainian conflict, this was by the time he did so, he was starting to get affiliated and associated with the Daily Wires of the world. And his first reaction, or what he thought was, I need a good expert on Ukraine. Who would be a really good expert on Ukraine? Oh, somebody with the last name Kagan. So that's who he interviewed. He interviewed a Kagan as if Kagan, these are independent experts on matters of Ukraine. It's like these are a couple of the biggest war whores the entire family, Victoria Nuland's married into him, God bless her, in the world. And yet Peterson didn't even know this. And he just accepted it at face value. Now, he's since moderated some of his positions on Ukraine, but now he's back doing the same thing. Why? Because he's got to, in my view, he trusts the wrong sources. And part of that is facilitated because he has a contract with the Daily Wire. And while not everyone at the Daily Wire is on the Neocon side, their leading person, Ben Shapiro, is one of the biggest neocons in the world. I don't know if there's a war he hasn't whored for at one time or another. He's not only very deeply pro-Israel, almost reflexively so, but he's very anti-Iran. He wants Iranian regime change. And is it really a coincidence that he's leveraging Jordan Peterson's credibility in a totally different space to convince people who just see Peterson as a brilliant mind to support his goal and his objective of trying to create regime change or conflict in Iran? And I've been telling people that I think, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but I think there's more risk of war with Iran than there is with China. I don't think war with China is, if you listen to McGregor and others, is something that anybody in the Pentagon really thinks is a winnable war. Whereas they still convince themselves that, one more Middle Eastern war is just the one we need to get over the top for the neocon dream, especially if Ukraine falls apart. They need, Afghanistan fell apart. Now Ukraine falls apart. Well, we got to have a new justification for the war, military industrial complex. We needed more validation for our neoconservative views of the world. Netanyahu's back in power in Israel and has always been wanting to let's go bomb Iran, bomb Iran, the old McCain meme. And I think that's partially what's happening, is that Peterson, in my view, should just stay out of this space. It's not a space he has any history of being any good at. I think he jeopardizes his credibility and his authenticity and his reliability when on issues he does know a lot about, psychology and broader issues of religion and culture, marriage and personal development. When he goes into these waters he clearly doesn't understand and is simply pitching military industrial complex propaganda, the neocon mantra. So I think it shows two things. It's a concern about where we're going. The fact that they're leveraging Peterson to try to start talking about Iran means that they're starting to level up and wanting to get into a military conflict with Iran, particularly as Ukraine falls apart, or is probably right on the cusp of falling apart. And it also shows the problem of gatekeeper Operation Mockingbird style media. That when you have these big institutional media structures that are really about limiting the Overton window, preventing certain topics from ever being discussed. You can have intense debate about trans rights, but just make sure your audience is on board on the deep state priorities, whether it's Ukraine conflict, whether it's Iranian war, whether it's trying to escalate in needless ways against China. And it's, and it's reflective thereof.
Well, thank you for that, Robert, because I must say I did not know that Jordan Peterson had taken this view on Iran. And I do find that extraordinary, given, as I said, given what you've been saying. I mean, this is a sensible, rational person. And at the same time, someone who has been so relentlessly criticized by the media. You'd have thought they'd be the last people that he would simply take their word for on a topic like this. But I've actually experienced this directly myself, and it's always bewildered me. Now, there's a friend of ours, friend especially of my wife's. I'm not going to embarrass by naming him, but he's a well-known actor, very famous actor in Britain, well-known also in the United States. Now, he takes a very rigidly pro-Ukrainian position, or at least he has done. And my wife asked him, where do you get all your ideas about Ukraine and about the war from? And he mentioned one very well-known British newspaper. Now, what was very strange about that was that same newspaper and some of the same journalists in that newspaper were people who this actor had sued because they'd told lies about him, sued successfully, I should say. So, I mean, it boggles the imagination why he believes them. Now, my wife did point this out, and he did take a step back, and he did see something of the contradiction there. But judging by what he writes on Twitter, I don't think it's changed his mind at all. He still doesn't seem to see that he's taking more fruit from the same poisoned tree, the poisoned tree that tried to poison him. And I've seen this again and again and again. People won't believe the media on things that they think they know about, but they believe the media about everything else. And I've never understood this. It just doesn't make any kind of sense to me. And I have to say, Jordan Peterson, all right, this actor is an actor. I mean, he's not a fundamentally political person. But Jordan Peterson, maybe he's not a political person, but he's one of those people who operates, if you like, on the margin of politics. I mean, he interplays with politics. You would have thought that he would have the sophistication and the ability to see beyond things, given how much he experiences and what he's gone through. And yet not at all. And I don't understand that. And, the fact that he works with, the Daily Wire and all of that. Well, again, you would have said that Peterson, of all people, he's gone so much against orthodoxies up to this point. He's been prepared to, act with great courage, great moral courage, whether you agree with him or whether you don't. He's shown a willingness and an ability to go against the mainstream on so many things, even to his own obvious material disadvantage. You wouldn't have thought that a person like that would be swayed along or by, a connection to a news outlet. And yet, there we go. As I said, I've seen this all the time. It bewilders me. It baffles me, but there it is.
Exactly. And I think Michael Crichton brilliantly termed it Gellerman amnesia, that someone will be sitting there reading a newspaper and about a topic they have personal familiarity, they'll realize this newspaper is full of crap. And then they'll read the very next article, and that will be their sole basis for interpreting the truth of that. Well, they said this, it must be true. And he always found it fascinating that discrepancy that you describe. And I think it also reflects a broader debate that the conservative comedian Steven Crowder just kind of stumbled into. I mean, this is a guy that, I don't follow for geopolitical analysis, except for the points that if I see him making fun of Zelensky, then I know, okay, something's happening in the broader culture that criticism is starting to get out, which he started to do towards the end of last year. And as someone that was at the Blaze, people don't know, he has a very popular YouTube channel, 6 million or so subscribers, so forth. Had 500,000 people watching live during the elections on Rumble. But mostly a culture commentator. He used to be an actor, and then he does skits, comedy routines, but he's mostly talking about wokeism. He's talking about issues of those related identity politics, issues of the Second Amendment, etc. Occasionally broaches into economics and politics, but isn't really like his geopolitics tends to be just conventional, the same sort of watered down Fox News, Rupert Murdoch version of the world. But he stumbled into this because he tried to do a contract for the Daily Wire, and the contract, to his surprise, had a cancel culture clause in it. And it's something that we've all dealt with at different levels, but it's the degree to which big tech, big media working together to shape the Overton window so that you can debate certain things, but not other things. You can broach certain topics, but not other topics. And it reflected a broader debate that many of those defending the Daily Wire's contract. And the Daily Wire does a lot of work that a lot of conservatives like in the cultural space. Most of their audience is religious-based, religious conservatives. But some of us have been very critical that they tend to be a leading spokesperson for neocon ideas. They tend to be for more war, and on topics like election issues, on topics like the vaccine at the time, on topics of the masks at the time, other things like that. They often were on the wrong side from a populist perspective. And the contract provision confirms things that we've been witnessing with personalities like Jordan Peterson, that as people get affiliated and associated with the Daily Wire, there's certain topics they no longer talk about. And for the most part, there's some exceptions, but also there's certain subjects they don't broadly publicize with any consistency. And they often advance a neocon agenda, especially on foreign policy. They have been, for those that don't know, the Daily Wire was founded as an anti-Trump, never Trump organization by a couple of billionaires in Texas, coming out of the fracking industry. And anybody familiar with American foreign policy or domestic political assassinations and other forms of corruption know that you put American with oil and American oil men, and you tend to get trouble more often than not. These folks, the H.L. Hunts of the world, think they should run the world. And they tend to have very distinct views. These particular brothers are part of a kind of a cultish religious sect, almost sectarian religious belief. It's a very small group. One of them is a pastor of his own thing, owns land everywhere. And these billionaire investors, you can assume that a lot of these people invest in media not to make money, but to control the narrative. They want only certain things discussed. They're often allied with corporate advertisers and big tech, along with their deep state, which the Twitter files has been revealing how much the deep state has been running big tech censorship and is behind the scenes on pretty much all of this, pulling the strings to make sure that you only talk about certain things. And you need them to talk about things that are popular with the conservative base, or they're useless, right? You can't be an effective gatekeeper unless a lot of people are attracted to you in the first place. So you need to attract them with the permissible areas of debate so that you detour them towards a deep state agenda in the end. And I think that what the Daily Wire Crowder debate revealed, though Crowder, I don't think fully understood this at all, was he was complaining about a cancel culture clause in a contract enforcing big tech's rules through private media contracts. But what he was stumbling into was one of the ways the institutional narrative gatekeeps and controls what people think and see and understand and hear. And the excuse is that this is done in the name of influence at the expense of independence, that this is power, sacrificing principle for power, which reflects a broader debate. But I think, and I wanted you guys' ideas on this, my view is almost anybody who sacrifices principles for power ends up attaining power that serves no principled use. And in the process, and throughout almost all of human history, look at who's really changed the world. Has it been the people who sacrificed independence for influence? No. It's people who understood the only way you gain real influence is by being independent. But what do you guys think?
Absolutely. I mean, what's the point of the media then? What's the point of going out and doing commentary if you're simply going to agree with what the people in power say? You're no longer serving any useful purpose at all in that case. And certainly not in any kind of democratic system, which is what we claim to have in the West, in the United States, even in Britain. Whether we have it in Britain is another matter, but that's another story. But I mean, that's absolutely the case. I mean, that is the proper function of people who do public commentary. If you want power, well, it's very simple. Go into business, certain types of business, the oil industry, if you like, or the finance industry, or something of that kind, or the arms industry, better still perhaps, or go into the intelligence services, and that's, you can get it there too, or, you know, parts of the civil service, or heavens help us, go into certain types of politics as well. But absolutely do not do it doing the kind of work we do. I mean, if you're all about power, then frankly, you're in the wrong industry. And if you're in the industry, you're in the wrong type of work, and you don't belong here. You are entirely, your presence is a corrupting one. Now, I'm going to say something else here. I think that not only should people who are, try to do commentary, public journalism, the way independent journalism, the way all three of us do, not only should we not be seeking power, I think we've got to be very, very careful when we get information from people who possess power. And this is my own view. I mean, especially when those people are not prepared to come off the record, but then insist that you must publish what they say. I was given this information from this anonymous official in the White House and that sort of thing, because the huge risk you run then is that you're just being manipulated, and you're being manipulated by people who have a particular agenda, which, all right, you might share it or you might not, but it's not the kind of thing you should be doing. You're not exercising critical control. You've got to be careful about getting too close to people like that. There are very, very few people, in my experience, my opinion, who I would trust as independent journalists or commentators, accessing people with power and getting information from them and getting their thoughts about anything. I would not trust myself with that. And I've worked in politics. So, I mean, I've seen how politicians, try and control the media. I'm going to say straight away, Robert, I think that you probably are one of those few people who could do it, because, you've got you're a centered person. You have also, I think, dare I say it, a certain type of knowledge and experience and personality that makes you able to, see through that sort of thing. But most people who operate in journalism, and as I said, I include myself, I am very, very careful. I don't want to get too close to people in power, and certainly I don't want to serve power. I don't think that plays any role in what I do. I don't think it should play any role in what the media does.
Exactly. I think like the irony of or some of the interesting aspects of the whole Crowder Daily Wire thing was the Daily Wire started screaming and attacking him because he was exposing something about a lot of even so-called independent conservative media in America, that like people still don't fully know, those that still get their information from Fox News, unless you're talking or following Tucker. Almost everybody else on there echoes the party line. Rupert Murdoch has been one of the biggest war whores in the world. He used the New York Post to tell every wacky, loony myth and lie about Ukraine in particular. Wall Street Journal, as soon as J.D. Vance, now Senator J.D. Vance, came out against getting involved in Ukraine and any kind of no-fly zone or anything like that, the Wall Street Journal did a hit piece on him. In fact, I remember having about an hour-long, maybe a little longer, conversation with Vance at the time he was making that decision, because he was thinking about it, and he was going through, this is what the practical issues a political figure faces. He was because people are like, why is there continued support for this war that by McGregor, great military mind, top Trump aide toward the end, was likely going to be his national security advisor in a second Trump term. This is why John Bolton was going around screaming bloody murder about Trump, saying you don't understand where he's going. He's really going to pull America out of NATO. He's really going to cut a deal with North Korea. He's really going to, not escalate any conflict with Russia, so on and so forth, was because a guy like McGregor was coming up the ranks, who particularly knew NATO well. And that was his prior area of expertise. Anybody can follow. His analysis has been dead on all the way through, really insightful, really prescient. It shows what Trump's second term could have been on that issue of foreign policy, whatever people think about Trump otherwise. And so but McGregor's voice, you don't hear on the Daily Wire. You don't, and there's a reason for that. And it's because what Crowder stumbled into was that the cancel culture clause was part of a broader aspect of gatekeeping the narrative, controlling the Overton window for perception, in that when they justify it by saying, but we have influence, but we have power, what they're really doing is their biggest influence is to undermine public policy on issues like Ukraine, to undermine our foreign policy, to undermine opposition to vaccines at the time it needed to be raised, to undermine opposition to mask and lockdowns at the precise time it needed to be raised, to expose how our elections are not operating the way they need to operate for people to have confidence in their integrity. They were on the wrong side of all of it for the most part. And Peterson's just the latest representation of that.
And what is so again, I come back to this. I mean, this is a theme I always return to on these programs, and some people get very annoyed with me when I say this. But what this is, this media getting so close to power is so profoundly un-American. It's completely anti-American. I mean, America was the country where, they first started referring to the media as the fourth estate. It's the first country in the world that actually passes a constitutional provision which protects the freedom of the media. Specifically, I don't think anybody else has done that, by the way. I mean, if you go to the European Convention on Human Rights, which is, the nearest approximation we have to a human rights charter and more like an anti-human rights charter on occasion, but never mind. But it doesn't actually do that. It talks about freedom of expression, doesn't specifically talk about freedom of the media. And the point is that the people who created the United States, the founders, understood that the media, a free, independent, critical media, was essential in a democracy. And, I know people always tell me, that they weren't setting up a democracy. And I've already argued previously, I'm absolutely no doubt at all that that was the direction that they were always heading towards. They always understood that. And that's why you see that in the First Amendment of the Constitution. And look at some of the people who were involved in the media in the United States. Tom Paine, a radical, extremist, difficult journalist, one of the founders, a person who'd almost been executed in France because he annoyed people there, got into huge trouble in England because, impossible for him to function in England. He's welcomed in the United States, and he's given a position in the United States which he would never have had in any other country at that time, because the United States then and later understood how important an independent media was as a key part of a political system, a balanced political system that made possible a democracy. Because ultimately, without a media that's able to explain things, discuss things, where different opinions are expressed, different ideas are expressed, different policies are discussed, how are the sovereign people going to be kept informed? And that's what this whole political system of democracy ultimately is all about. So again, when you have a situation where the media and the state power join, that is a fundamental violation of the original conception upon which America, the modern United States of America, the United States of America that we all used to know and have placed such great value in, that all goes away. That is no longer possible anymore. And of course, if you have a provision like the First Amendment of the Constitution, it is based always on the premise that the media and the political class will function separately. And Robert, you've made the point previously, and I think it's a very important one, and people should always remember it, that historically in the United States, and by the way in Britain as well, the people who ran the political system, the politicians, the leaders, and the journalists often came from different demographics. Journalism used to be a working class profession. Now, of course, it's not. All of these people today who run the media, who run the administration, who they're on the National Security Council, in the State Department, in all the alphabet of intelligence agencies. They went to the same schools, they went to the same universities, they met each other, they go to the same parties, they are always mixing. And that is a very, very dangerous thing.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and you see the shift. Like if you go back and get the old articles and letters and archives from people at, say, Newsweek or people at Time from, say, the 1960s, 1970s, you know, they're complaining to Alan Dulles and others, please, I don't want to continue to just be a stenographer for the CIA. Can you please just let me out of this thing? Can I please at least pretend to be independent for a week? You know, remembering the old proverb, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world but lose his own soul? Today, these kids are giddy about, oh, I have a CIA connection. I have an NSA connection. I have a State Department connection. This makes me important. This makes me relevant. This makes me cool. I'm like hanging out with James Bond. You know, so it's that sort of mindset, and you see it reflected in how deferential they are, despite when they get embarrassed. I mean, you would think you would be humiliated as a reporter if you got caught lying about the Iraq War, then caught lying about what was going on in Afghanistan, caught lying repeatedly about Russiagate. I mean, it just continues to be unraveled, because now we know that the Russian bots trying to shape American policy, domestically and foreign, that was a fake story. Now, you guys were talking about that from the get-go, that you could just use common sense and inference and know it was a fake allegation, but tons of people in America bought it. And of course, Twitter itself, as the Twitter files reveal, I don't know who in the Biden administration or the deep state ticked off Elon Musk, but man, that was a mistake, because somebody did something that agitated him. So he's like, screw it, I'm just going to turn on the lights and see how the world looks. But be careful what billionaires you screw around with, just FYI. Like screwing around with Trump. You know, Obama decided to make fun of Trump when Trump came down to that to the National Press Club get together in, I think, 2013, and humiliated him right in front of the whole crowd. That was the day Donald Trump was guaranteed to run for president. I was like, be careful who you take off. But what it reveals is it was all fake. Hamilton 68 was the biggest election interference that took place. Hamilton 68, and I encourage people to look at it. Matt Taibbi is covering it in detail. Glenn Greenwald's covering it in detail. But what it reveals is the template for how the system operates. In that you have here, a lot of the government actors were just affirming or confirming things after the fact. The main people were ex-government actors, ex-NSA, ex-FBI, ex-CIA. Like the FBI guy who helped run Russiagate, turns out was, corrupt, working for Oleg and some other oligarchs, right? Just classic. But you look at it so you look at that. It is really revelatory for how the system operates, how they corrupt the message, corrupt the narrative, how you combine these think tanks with big tech, with co-opted so-called conservative media outlets, and that's how you get fake narratives that shape people's perspective of foreign policy.
Absolutely. I don't know whether you've read this achingly long piece from the Columbia Journalism Review about the media's coverage of Russiagate. And I've been reading it, and I'll be straightforward about this, Robert. I was reading it and, learning 5 years after the fact that the three of us were right all along. And, the New York Times and the Washington Post and CNN got it all, they got it all wrong. But of course, they were always acting with good faith. You must always remember that. They were always acting with good faith. They were misled. They didn't understand. They got too close. I have to say, it was just an astonishing thing to read for me. And even this milksop of an admission, that they didn't get it quite right. It was all, slightly wrong. Maybe Hillary had something to do with conjuring up Russiagate. Maybe Christopher Steele wasn't the most reliable person. Maybe there's some problems about some parts of the story. Well, even this thing, the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, they don't mention it. I haven't seen a single reference to it, even in these newspapers. They're still pretending. Well, I don't know what they're pretending anymore, but they certainly don't want to admit that they were wrong. They haven't come out fully, straightforwardly, and said, we got it completely wrong. And I'm going to say something, actually. Until there is a proper reckoning about Russiagate in America and American journalism, a dark cloud is going to hang over both journalism, that the Columbia Journalism Review got right, by the way, but also over politics in the United States. Because unless this thing is finally dissipated once and for all, unless it's finally acknowledged that that whole nonsense that was spread for all those years was absolute, complete nonsense, then one can't speak about a proper media in America, and politics continues to be corrupted because far too many people in America, far too many people in Britain, most people I know in Britain, still continue to believe that the lies that were told during Russiagate are true because nobody authoritative has told them otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, these days, instead of the New York Times publishing the Pentagon papers, they are the Pentagon's paper. I mean, that's how the shift has really taken place.
Yeah.
And sort of an example of this that relates to a story that to a question that was in the super chats of Andrew Tate in Romania. So I know Tate. I met him years ago.
I've been waiting for you to talk about this. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those out there, do I agree with all of Andrew Tate's view of gender relationships? No, I don't. I always took it as machismo, usually an over-the-top machismo that represents, absent father figures and things like that. That's who I've usually heard it from. And I was always kind of dismissive of it. But when I talked to him, he had very independent views, though, on a wide range of other policies about the World Economic Forum, Davos, globalism, foreign war, whether you should be drafted in the military, that I thought young men should hear. And I had encouraged him to be more outspoken. I was like, you got a pretty decent, he already had a decent platform. It grew from there. I was like, you already got a decent platform where people are interested in you for your perspective on these other topics. Why not use that kind of as a reverse Jordan Peterson? And I was use that access to people that are coming to you for this one principle to educate them on why they shouldn't, go volunteer for foreign wars, why they should. That's not how you define a man. That doesn't make you a man. That makes you a sucker. That makes you a sap. Don't get engaged, don't be the pawn of politicians, so on and so forth. And then and to his credit, about a year ago, he started doing it. He started using his platform to attack the World Economic Forum, attack pandemic politics, attack Ukraine politics, attack a whole bunch of things. Now, I had conversations with him about Romania. It's like he had more confidence in the Romanian legal system than I did. I was like, I'm not so sure about, certain aspects, like make sure you protect yourself. The Romania has a reputation for a reason, put it that way. They also still have wild dogs all around Bucharest, which is totally weird. At least last time I was there. It's like, what is this? And apparently a bunch of them were released in the 90s and now they're just roaming the city. I don't know if they ever fix that problem, but that's the permanent image in my head of Romania. It's like that and Dracula. So I've never had like a saying, trust the government kind of approach. But you look at, he's been in the webcam business for quite a while. You can dislike the webcam business, no problem. I'm not a fan. I don't encourage people to go into the business. But everything surrounding him was that he was not involved in any kind of illegal criminal activities. That, he's a charmer who was very good at technology, knew the Western market, and so could bridge the gap between East Central European women looking for an opportunity to make money, and knowing the audience, knowing the technological means of doing it, setting up a house that created it. But there'd been occasional accusations against him over time, but nothing had ever come of it. I'd never seen any evidence supporting it. And so now all of a sudden he's under arrest. I mean, you got to love the Romanian system. You can go to jail without even being charged. So it's like, okay, what a nice system. Apparently, they can detain you up to 2 years. First, I thought it was 30 days, but some people were interpreting Romanian law to be longer. Some prominent ex-European prosecutors that have looked at the case have said the case looks very questionable and dubious to them. It has subsequently come out, but not been talked about a lot, that the Biden administration, that this arrest only happened after the Biden administration specifically requested that Romania arrest him and investigate him and basically shut him up. And I don't think it has anything to do with this webcam business. The so-called victims say they've gone forward 3 different times to Romanian authorities, and they've come out publicly and said, we're not victims. Well, we have no idea why you're calling us victims. We're not victims. A bunch of other women that worked for them said there was never any problematic behavior at all. And, I represented victims of abuse around the world. It's not common for these for traffickers, victims, to come out and vouch for that person's integrity when they're not even connected to that person anymore and they're countries and continents away. So I think the investigation is very questionable. I think it was brought for politicized purposes. And I think it relates to Romania's interest if to the sort of hush-hush style analysis you guys did with your thought experiment. If you look at Romania, there's a little part of Ukraine they wouldn't mind having back. And definitely they wouldn't mind having Moldova back in the fold. They've never really given up their claim on it. And Romania is clearly a staging ground for some NATO activities. More U.S. troops are located there on a regular basis. It would be one of the entrevues of any entrance of foreign troops into Ukraine. The main one would be Poland, but the other one would be Romania, up by the part of the Black Sea portion that some people, like Scott Ritter mentioned, think Russia will take back as Novorossiya, that they'll take back the whole Black Sea. And to take back the whole Black Sea portion of Ukraine requires they go right up against the border of Romania. Romania was considered the possible staging ground for some of the attacks on Snake Island, for some of the attacks on the naval operations of Russia, including the ships. Though what actually happened in some of those cases still open to debate. But there's almost no way they could have achieved anything. If they did achieve anything, they had to probably use Romania as a staging ground in part for some of those activities. So Romania's complicity in this tells me that Andrew Tate is just the victim, the latest political victim of what's motivating them is not interest in whether his webcam business was run perfectly. They're interested in shutting him up because he was reaching an audience that otherwise wasn't being reached. In other words, you have these sort of young men that are interested in topics of masculinity that aren't paying attention to the media one way or the other, or at least not independent media. And their source of authority is telling them this war is bogus. These international conflicts are nonsense. Don't join up. Don't volunteer like the British Foreign Secretary that was encouraging the British mercs to go over there, until they ended up captured and executed. Then they pretended they never did that. So I think that's the broader context of the Andrew Tate case. Now, I don't have any I've limited professional experience with the Romanian criminal justice system. It was enough that I knew I didn't want to have any further in a role. But I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on that.
No. Well, first of all, I've no experience with the Romanian system. I've heard things about it which would certainly not, dissuade me from wanting to get involved in it. And I think this is a long-standing problem. I certainly wouldn't have advised him to. I would have told him to keep very clear of that part of the world. That's definitely the view I would have told. Look, I'm not somebody who's familiar with this case at all, any of the details of it, but everything that you've just said, Robert, makes complete sense to me. And I have to say this, it is so consistent with everything else that we're seeing. Politicized cases, and from this administration especially, what's this expression? Lawfare. Use of the law, not the law, actually, use of the legal apparatus, the law enforcement apparatus, so-called, to try and go after your political enemies. We're seeing this happen all the time, and I can completely believe, I have no difficulty believing that somebody who'd achieved some degree of, sway over people of a certain demographic, important demographic, and who was coming up with views that the administration doesn't like, would be targeted in some way, and that the administration would use the levers that it has in Romania, which I am absolutely sure would be very, very susceptible to this kind of political manipulation, in order to basically silence him, and not just silence him, but also discredit him by spreading stories and bringing claims about him, which frankly are going to damage his reputation amongst lots of people. I've seen too much of this now to really have much doubt that it goes on and that it could affect somebody like him. When I say goes on, not only does it go on, it goes on systemically, which is what's so dangerous. If
absolutely.
there's one isolated case, that would be very bad already. But it's not just one isolated case; it is a systemic thing with this administration. So, given that is so, I am predisposed to believe what you say about this case, about Andrew Tate, is true.
Well, it fits the old Edwin Edwards principle, which Edwards said the only way they were going to get him, great governor of the great state of Louisiana, famously beat David Duke in 1991 with a bumper sticker that said, "Vote for the crook. It's important." The feds indicted him 4 times before they finally got him. Old school, Democratic-oriented populist from Cajun country in Louisiana. But what he said was the only way they're going to get me is if they, or he goes, if they really want to get me, you'll suddenly find me in bed with either a dead girl or a live boy. And that was, Edwards' way of putting things. Like Edwards was famous. Somebody accused him of sleeping with 5 women in a single night. And Edwards came out and said, that's a complete lie. He left before the 6th one came in. That was Edwin Edwards. But what it reflected is the weaponization, the political weaponization of Me Too accusations, because we've seen it with Trump. That a lot of those allegations I never believed. They didn't make sense. They only happen when he's running for president, right? He's been a public figure for 40 years, a lot of money for a lot of time. Only now do people want to do something about it. So much so that the New York Manhattan District Attorney is now trying to use the Stormy Daniels payoff case as the only way to hang Trump for criminal indictments. They're obsessed with stopping Trump at any cost, which should tell you something for even the people out there that are critical of Trump, that there's something unique about Trump from the system's perspective. There's something about them they see as uniquely threatening that they don't see in anybody else on the prominent public square. But then you look at how they went after Julian Assange, right? They started off going after Assange on rape allegations that to this day I'll run to people and say, how in the world can you defend a rapist? And I'm like, do you realize what the accusation actually was? That the accusation was he didn't use a condom the right way? And I was like, I got a news flash for you. If not using birth control as you told somebody you're using is rape, well, there's a lot of NBA players that got a lot of claims against their various baby mamas out there that said, hey, don't worry, honey, I'm on the pill. And hey, surprise, surprise, you owe me 21% for the next 18 years of your annual salary. Right? That's who does most failure to execute birth control, correct? We've never called that rape or sexual assault. That's insane. And we've seen it. They took out Steve Wynn that way. You look at Steve Wynn, he starts to become friendly with China. He has power within the Trump administration. He's using his billionaire casino status to start being politically active. They don't like it. What happens? He suddenly gets Me Too. Doesn't mean the accusations in his case weren't true. I know all the stories here in Vegas. Steve had some interesting traits, shall we say. But it's why did it happen? When did it happen? How did it happen? What was the real motivation for it happening? By the way, it kind of happened with Jeff Bezos. That a little story people aren't paying much attention to is Jeff Bezos is selling the Washington Post. He's going to buy a football team instead. I know a lot of the backstories of Bezos for reasons I won't get into. I don't represent him, but I represented other people that had concerns with him. Bezos became obsessed that he believed somebody leaked a bunch of private information. People remember way back about leaving his wife and certain texts coming out, all that kind of stuff. And when he dug in, he concluded it wasn't his purported, like people try to convince him it was the Saudis, even other people. He dug in and he concluded it was deep state type people. Who were allied with competitors on big Pentagon contracts, and that's why they did it. And he only bought the Post to try to influence, make sure he got those fat contracts from the Defense Department. That was the only reason to get it. And when he found that out, he's like, screw it, I'm out of politics, and I'm stepping back. And then watch, they'll do it against Elon Musk. My guess is the next line of allegations won't be fraud or stock allegations, the rest. It will be Me Too type allegations. Musk has the crazier they are, the more Musk falls in love with them. I mean, there's no better example than Amber Heard that he dated for a period of time, or Amber Turd, as some people call her, unfortunately. God bless the guy. His Twitter has been backing up this personality called Eliza Blue, who Viva and I had previously interviewed, who was supposed to be about targeting human trafficking. You dig in and it looks more like an effort to liberalize human trafficking principles to the kind of Me Too allegations we were getting on college campuses in America, which were reduced effectively to, I regret something happening last night, but not that anything was truly non-consensual in the traditional definitions, legal definitions of sexual assault. And so I think, the Me Too be skeptical if you see a prominent dissident personality suddenly accused of a Me Too type scandal. That's all. It's going to keep happening. They've had too much success with it. They're going to keep pursuing it. I would just tell everybody. And the irony, of course, is anybody that knows these powerful people, they're the worst Me Too abusers in the world. I mean, that's always, I tell my daughter, if a guy tells you he's a male feminist, run, get as far away from possible, give him a fake number, don't let him know your real name, hit the door, because they always end up like stalkers and creepoids all the time. You can be a feminist, but they call themselves a male feminist. Nah. So I think you're going to see more of this kind of Me Too. Look for it going forward so that you recognize it the next time it happens. That what they did to Assange was never going to be a one-off.
No, absolutely.
I have to ask, can I just ask you one question, Robert?
Yeah.
That kind of is bothering me a little bit. I'm curious about it, actually. Trump the other day, he was in South Carolina and he was kind of laying out certain policies. And he was flanked by Lindsey Graham. And I was watching Tucker Carlson last night, and he actually went into a little bit more detail about how Lindsey Graham is going to be very much involved in the Trump campaign, and he's one of Trump's biggest supporters. And Tucker couldn't figure it out. He's like, Trump, MAGA, Lindsey Graham. He's like, what's going on here? I have to ask you, now that we have you here, what do you think is going on here?
One name, Nikki Haley, or Neocon Nikki. So Nikki Haley is the former governor of South Carolina. And so Nikki Haley, on February 15th, the day after Valentine's, as a love curse to the world, she's going to announce her presidential campaign. She is the deep state's favorite on the Republican side because they see her in the Obama, Trudeau, Macron kind of template that they like, but they prefer you be someone that's charismatic, intelligent, but that you have the added diversity checkoff points. Right? She'd be the first woman president. She's Indian American or whatever. I forget the back, but I think that's background. But foreign ancestry. And so they think, she'd be perfect. This is the identity politics version of deep state policy. Have it look a little bit different, but sell the same package. And so Trump's concern, his primary concern, is all the talk of trying to get DeSantis in. The reason why he keeps attacking DeSantis is to tell DeSantis to stay home and don't get in. That's like, people think it's ego and the rest. And at time early on, I thought that's what it was. But as I've seen it develop and heard all the chatter out of DC and from some of DeSantis's circle, what I had heard a year ago, or maybe it was 2 years ago, but I think a year ago, was DeSantis was hooking up with Trump and going to run as VP. That made perfect sense for DeSantis because he's got a terrible record as a congressman, great record as a governor, but awful, atrocious record as a congressman. He said his hero was George W. Bush when he went for Congress. He said his icon who he wanted to emulate was Paul Ryan. The man whose foreign policy he followed once he got up there was Tom Cotton. He supported the Maidan coup and wanted more U.S. support for it. He 3 times voted for the Trans-Pacific Partnership deal, the bad trade deal that would have further hurt American jobs that Trump tore up the moment he got in. He's basically been a regime change champion. He did oppose bombing Syria, to his credit. But for the most part, he was a neocon guy, and his whole resume screamed deep state recruit. This is a guy from a working class background, but he goes to Yale, then Harvard, then the military. And when in the military, he's getting assigned to Guantanamo and Fallujah. You're not, that's somebody's tailoring your career to get into a certain path. Now, personally, I wasn't surprised by some of his counter, WEF counter globalist policies as governor, because he's got a deep working class Italian American background, and others, and that's a populist history and heritage that people tend to fall back on, and that's why I think he still has potential as a presidential candidate. But he would be a disaster. But there's reasons to be concerned too. Right before he ran for governor, he said a bunch of anti-Trump things on the issue of Ukraine and Putin and all that jazz. Now, as governor, he's been mostly mute on all of it, to his credit, and he's been publicly critical of the World Economic Forum. But though Trump is just, all the people in D.C. are really trying to elevate DeSantis as a distraction. I don't think there's any chance DeSantis runs. I never thought that. It's possible somebody fills his ego so big that he thinks he's going to do it, but he's at heart, DeSantis is a pragmatist with a combination of deep state donors and populist instincts. And where all that comes out in the end, who knows? Might be like George Corley Wallace, who had 3 careers. Once as a pro-civil rights populist with Big Jim Folsom, then as a segregationist in the 60s, then as the guy who built the biracial Democratic populist political machine in Alabama post-1972 based on black voters voting for George Corley Wallace in overwhelming numbers. And so why? Because Wallace was a pragmatist with populist instincts and deep state donors. Poor George Corley had to keep apologizing when he made the mistake of putting Curtis Bombs Away LeMay on the ticket as vice president. Because LeMay kept talking about, we need to nuke him. We need to nuke him. And he was like, Wallace, no, he didn't. He really didn't mean that. He didn't mean that. And LeMay was like, no, we really need to nuke him. We need to nuke him. We got these nukes. We got to use them while we can. Basically his character was loosely the George C. Scott character in Dr. Strangelove. It was based on Curtis LeMay, who was commander of the Air Force at the time. LeMay was the guy who was smoking cigars at Kennedy's autopsy. To give you an idea of who LeMay was. But there's all these other sides of Wallace that the people don't understand unless they understand he's a mixed personality. I think DeSantis is too. But so the only person that's guaranteed to run against Trump is Haley. And Haley is the one that's going to have big defense backers, big military industrial complex backers. Murdoch's probably going to back her. Murdoch's waiting to see what's going to happen, but you're likely going to see, watch the write-ups after she announces. See what the Daily Wire says. See what the Wall Street Journal says. See what the New York Post says. The Daily Wire loves Nikki Haley. So Trump's looking at the map. Iowa, he's probably okay unless Pence runs, because Iowa is shaped by the religious conservatives. They're about almost half of the caucus vote in Iowa. That's why the polls are always wrong on the Republican side. They always underestimate the religious share. Trump probably should be okay with that vote. Pence could create maybe some issues, but he's almost persona non grata with so many Trump MAGA supporters that I think he's DOA. I don't even think he'll run. And then, of course, as a topic we'll get into, he, like everybody else, has a bunch of classified documents sitting at home because we overclassify everything in the world. And how are you going to monetize your prior access to the to office unless you can say, hey, look at this little classified documents? It's your bona fides to get the payoffs from whatever consulting gig or other gig you're getting or giving. But so Iowa's probably okay. New Hampshire's trouble because the politics have shifted in New Hampshire. Trump really needs someone to challenge Biden or to have an open primary so that independent voters don't flood the New Hampshire Republican primary just to screw Trump. But all these Massachusetts types have moved into southern New Hampshire, and their favorite candidate is Buttigieg. I have a different pronunciation for it, but I'll save it for locals. Because he's always complaining about how people pronounce his name. But that would be kind of a risk for New Hampshire. So what does it mean? What's always been the firewall for Republicans? South Carolina. But Nikki Haley is the former governor of South Carolina. Now, the Trump's only supporter in 2016 in South Carolina was the then lieutenant governor. The reason Trump put Nikki Haley and elevated her to position, knowing she planned on challenging him in the future, potentially, was to make that lieutenant governor governor. It was a reward to him for standing by Trump early on. That lieutenant governor is now governor, so he's got his support. But Trump is nervous about South Carolina, and he's concerned because of Nikki Haley more than anybody else. That's why he's saddling up with Lindsey Graham sweet talking Lindsey Graham, and yeah, you're going to be special. I'm going to really listen to you. You're really right, Lindsey. You really nailed that. Good, good hit on that last golf shot. Good job, Lindsey. You're the man. There's going to be a lot of that because he wants Lindsey under the belief that Lindsey will have great influence on him in exchange for Graham immunizing him in South Carolina from Nikki Haley.
Interesting. I mean, does Nikki Haley have any chance at all? Looking at this from London, I would have thought that she'd go down in flames. Frankly, I find it very difficult. I remember her very well from when she was a U.S. ambassador to the UN. And by the way, an absolutely terrible, appalling, horrendous U.S. ambassador at the UN. Not as bad as Samantha Power, but, well, that'd be a hard feat to actually equal that record. So, I cannot imagine Nikki Haley, winning against Trump. But then maybe I'm getting this wrong. What are the chances there, Robert?
I think, people are experimenting with different, I'll be curious to see what nicknames Trump comes up with. Neocon Nikki, Nutty Nikki. There's a couple of that potentially resonate. We'll see which one he pins on her. To a certain degree, it's great for Trump to have as his key opponent a big neocon advocate, because the easiest way he can distinguish himself from her is by emphasizing what he's recently escalated doing. Here, the biggest leader in the Western world calling for immediate peace and the end of the Ukrainian conflict is Donald John Trump. It's like, for all the criticisms people may have of Trump, many of them legitimate and understandable, he's still the number one leader in the Western world with any kind of political power or prominence, saying, end the war now. That escalation is insane. I think, as he put it, was first tanks, then nukes. No bueno. And now, in Trump's own, verbiage. Now, people will probably be thrown off a bit by Trump, the way Trump will couch this. So he won't say, hey, Putin's a reasonable, rational, smart guy that's a good guy, that we should just cut a deal with. Even if he believes it, he's never going to say that publicly, because the MAGA base is split between two different wings. On one wing is the old school American conservative, populist, anti-war, anti-foreign intervention tradition. That is the longest and deepest streak in it. But after World War II and the rise of a permanent military industrial complex in America, with lots of soldiers going through that, lots of people working in that industry, it created another parallel part of the conservative cause. And that is the machoistic, militaristic wing. Now, these are people who often don't actually want conflict, but they want to see conflict resolved or prevented on the pretext of strength. Hence, Reagan, peace through strength. George Corley-Wallace, his approach to Vietnam. We're going to bomb the hell out of them, and then we're going to get right out, right? So he's got the peace angle, but with the macho angle. So Trump did this throughout his 2016 campaign. Like, people could never figure out, why is he talking about peace in one place and then talking about bombing the hell out of ISIS in the other? Because he was trying to parallel that track of these two different groups. He wants the working class, macho, militaristic, likely background in the military person to feel comfortable with his approach, even though his objective is almost always a peace-oriented objective. First president not to start a new war in a long time, not a coincidence. So you'll probably likely hear that track. But what it's going to continue to put pressure on the MAGA wing of Republicans in office to raise more questions about Ukraine, to have more skepticism towards Ukraine, no more money for Ukraine, to get the heck out of Ukraine. And you not only have McGregor doing what he's doing, which has been the best military analysis I've seen in the American media by anybody. I've tried to encourage him and his people to reach out to more places, but and then to his credit, Tucker Carlson has been one to talk about it, but almost nobody else at Fox does. And a few people at Daily Wire have done it, but not Ben Shapiro so much. So we'll see how much it reaches out. But when Zelensky is a meme, and increasingly he's a meme, it's like economic problems take on new meaning in the public parlance when eggs become a meme, When it's like, hey, you really want to shake her up for Valentine's? Get her a dozen eggs. She'll be the greatest thing ever, right? That sort of thing. When you see that start to reach popular culture, that sort of mass approach, that's now been happening with Zelensky over the last several months in the United States. Like now it's, do you want to make billions from home? Have your own home-owned business? I can tell you how. And it's a picture of Zelensky, right? You know, it's Zelensky making the mistake of doing his Che Guevara impression in the U.S. Congress was a mistake, right? The showing up with like people are like, why is this guy in pajamas talking to Congress? Well, what is this? So it's not how that Che imagery that they've worked so well for sort of the millennial audience in certain parts of the Instagram world doesn't translate to your older conservative. Who are like, I don't want somebody who looks like Fidel Castro that I'm giving money to. Well, why is he dressed like that? It's disrespectful, that kind of thing. That did not go over the way they thought it would. Now, Boris is over here, and Boris has been doing different parts of his Western pro-Ukraine tour. And apparently recently, I just saw the headline, attacked. He goes, have you heard about this Tucker Carlson guy? This guy's crazy. And it's like, Boris, stick to lying about Putin threatening you, pal. The taking on Tucker, bad idea. Like that's the one person, if you're trying to appeal to American conservatives, you don't attack. Talking about the number one conservative media influencer in the United States. Now, I would say he is a co-equal that goes under the radar, that shows how independent media can really work. And that's, of course, the one and the only Alex Jones. There's a reason why he has no corporate advertisers. He has no big tech compliant policies. And he has, as is evidenced by the fact, been deplatformed everywhere. And he doesn't take any sugar daddy billionaire oligarch cash. But so we'll see how all of that sort of translates in the end. But I think the Trump's position on Ukraine, the fact that he's increasingly escalating the peace focus, it'll probably come with language that will say, oh, I'll tell Putin, and he'll just sit, that's how he'll sell it to the militaristic base. He doesn't really believe that because you can see how he acted for 4 years. He never actually threatened military power against Putin or Russia. He doesn't think that's the way to get there. He thinks that's a way to persuade the macho part of his audience that thinks Putin is the devil, why and how a peace deal is a good outcome. But no question, Trump's going to be running as the peace candidate in 2024.
What you just said reminds me of Reagan, because Paul Craig Roberts, who has told me in person, and he's also said it many times in public, and Jack Matlock, who was Reagan's ambassador to Moscow, said it very recently in public in an interview which I was involved, that Reagan always had to balance the fact that part of his base wanted peace, but he had to always counterbalance that with the other side of the base, the people that exactly the people you described, who wanted peace through strength type sort of policies. And that, in fact, this rhetoric that Reagan had to use, which misled lots of people at the time, including me, by the way, was in fact all about keeping that coalition together and buying the political space to make the kind of peace deals which he eventually did. So I can completely understand that. I have to say, it's very interesting, actually, Robert, about, Nikki Haley, South Carolina, the politics there. But of course, isn't there a danger that, if you bring a person like Lindsey Graham into, it's the wolf bringing it into the hen house. In fact, I mean, he's going to want something in return, I presume. I mean, I don't know how, well organized and sophisticated Lindsey Graham is. I don't know how popular or powerful a figure he is either, but he's I would have thought not a person you want particularly close to you. That just saying. I mean, just
no question. But you probably get a sense of where Trump is going by the fact that a day after he's standing on the stage with Lindsey Graham, the biggest current war whore for the war in Ukraine, Trump's the biggest outspoken for immediate peace in Ukraine. So that's why I think Trump's personnel problems will continue and are a major risk point for him, no question whatsoever. But that's independent of and beyond Graham. I think Graham believes, and Trump's probably led him to believe, that Graham would have direct influence on him during his administration in exchange for his support now. But anybody that knows Trump knows that isn't worth a whole lot, good, bad, or otherwise. That Trump's going to do whatever he's going to do, And the key is going to be getting more McGregors around him in a second term than Graham's around him in a second term. But that's where I would pay attention to what Trump says on Ukraine as the best indicator of where he's planning on going in a second term. I think John Bolton is right that Trump, I know it from people who are running the Office of Personnel and Management. That was the most populist wing at the end of Trump's term, and they were stacking up people to put in a second term that was going to dramatically shift Trump in a direction that matched up his policy to his rhetoric a lot more than happened in his first term. And so and obviously, I don't think the Ukraine conflict ever happens if Trump wins, or if Trump is declared the winner, I should say. Some people, have justifiable cause to believe he may have actually been the most popular choice in the Electoral College by the actual voter intentions, but that's another story for another day. But I think that that's where to focus on with Trump is, where that what he says about Ukraine, and the fact he's willing to be more and more and more assertive is, I think, revelatory. And you can also know what the system thinks he's going to do by how much they escalate against him. So, like, if you go back, like when he bombed Syria, he bombed an empty airfield and called everybody 6 hours in advance and told them which airfield was going to bomb. So it was it was truly a show war. But remember, the media gave him massive amounts of praise. I think CNN was like, tonight he became president of the United States. So you can know what the system believes by how they react to Trump. If for some reason the system suddenly doesn't have any problem with Trump, the lawsuits drop, the criminal investigations go away, there's no challenging or contesting him or anything else, then I would be concerned. You're seeing just the opposite. They're trying to indict him in Georgia on election issues. They're running into legal hurdles because he committed no crime. That's always a problem when you want to prosecute somebody. In the District of Columbia, they're running into trouble on the classified documents case because those poor lawyers stumbled into Biden's files at the University of Delaware and studied it and found a big stash of classified docs. Then you, of course, so that's why you're suddenly seeing they're going to go after him in New York and indict him for paying Stormy Daniels for a non-disclosure agreement that really had nothing to do with the campaign. It's not, everybody at that point knew who Trump was. I remember telling people the Access Hollywood tape would not make a big deal because it's like most conservatives already knew who Trump was. None of them were, holding him up as a personal moral symbol. As people said, in the religious community, I'm not voting for pastor, I'm voting for president. Those are two different things. That goes all the way back to Ronald Reagan, who had been thrice divorced, or at least twice divorced when he was elected, over Jimmy Carter, the deeply moral Christian, by Christian conservatives who changed their vote. So the fact the system keeps coming after him should tell you that they think Trump continues to pose an existential threat to deep state power. So that's their opinion. And so that, I think, will be a better barometer. Now, on the classified document cases, my own view is I think it's a white hat that disclosed this, not a deliberate effort of the deep state to take out Biden, because they have other better, easier means to take out Biden. It's an open secret, and has been for decades, that Biden and his family were one of the most corrupt political families in the history of American politics. His brother, his sister, his son, all of them cashed in on his name. That's how, and it wasn't for themselves mostly, because there always had to be a little, at least 10% for the big guy. My guess would be a lot more than 10%. And apparently it was laundered through rent payments, is the latest apparent evidence that Hunter was paying $40,000, $50,000 a month for a place that cost $5,000, maybe on the high end. That's one of the great ways you launder cash. That's old school money laundering right there. And is it a coincidence that they found additional classified docs at his home where Hunter was staying? And they're just hanging out in the garage, apparently. Now, part of this is the problem Julian Assange long identified. We overclassify documents in America. Talking about Lindsey Graham, you see, that's his new excuse for deep state corruption with Biden, because maybe we classified too much. Really? You think so? When we're classifying everything under the sun. and also Assange is right. We don't classify to protect national security. We classify to cover up government corruption. That's what we do. We classify so the ordinary American doesn't know the horrible, corrupt, bad acts our politicians do and those who serve them in the deep state, or those who serve the deep state in positions of power, more like. So, but I think what appears to have happened is Biden's own lawyers reviewing the documents to bring up discover, oh crap, there's classified documents. And because of the Trump scandal, that they're like, I don't want to get in the middle of that again. I don't want to be one of those people stuck on that, where they're looking at Trump's lawyers and what they said or didn't say about classified documents or documents marked classified. And so in Trump's case, they could have been declassified. In Biden's case, they likely couldn't have been, because he wasn't the one that originally classified them. And as vice president, or as senator, he didn't have declassification authority in all likelihood for most of those. And he's not governed in the same scale by the Presidential Records Act that likely helps Trump have a legal defense. And they all hit it. Chief of staff had to leave from the Biden administration. The White House, Ron Klain, old corrupt hack, by the way. He's going to cash in, I'm sure, in 5 seconds anyway. But because he helped orchestrate the cover-up. Had to get the National Archives to shut up, Justice Department to shut up, FBI to shut up, NSA to shut up, CIA to shut up. And I think somebody in that group that sees the allegations against Trump as bogus. Like, they're not a lot of white hats, but there are some white hats still within. And you see this on Ukraine, by the way. Now, you've seen less of it to a degree over the last 6 months. But remember, early on, somebody was leaking from the Pentagon repeatedly, telling a very different story than the official story. And it would come out in different publications. Be like, nope, this isn't actually going the way they say. Nope, this isn't going to work the way they say. Nope, this isn't going to progress. And it's still happening. I remember, Alex, you referenced the Financial Times article that went through great detail that said people in Wall Street in the financial world are being told something very different in the city of London than they're in the city of London, rather than London, the city, than what we're being told out here in ordinary middle America. So I think that the net effect of it is they leaked it not to take Biden out, but they leaked it to kill the investigation of Trump and the political weaponization of classified information. And all the efforts to cover it up worked for the purposes of getting it to pass the election, but it creates its own. I think that's why that investigation is going to die on the vine. I thought there was always bogus legal prosecution anyway, but it's why they're suddenly talking about Stormy Daniels, and the New York DA who had dropped the case is suddenly talking about re-prosecuting Trump, is they've started to give up that they're going to get him on the classified doc issue. Now, that doesn't mean Biden doesn't have separate issues. You're seeing continued publications talk about they don't want Biden to be the candidate in 2024. Media pollsters are running one way you know what's going to happen is the media will poll on topics they otherwise don't poll on. Mostly the media avoids polling on. Like, have you seen a major U.S. media-backed poll do a meaningful poll on Ukraine in a long time? You'll see it in some other places, but generally they don't poll on the topic. That tells you that they don't want the world to know what Americans actually think on the topic in terms of giving a bunch of money, risking nuclear war, any of that activity, putting our own boys at risk, all of that, which I believe is very unpopular amongst the ordinary American. But I think we'll see some. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No. Okay. I just wanted to say, by the way, about opinion polls. It's also the case in Britain. Remarkably few opinion polls, and asking really searching questions about the Ukrainian issue. And one does wonder why, and one does sense that perhaps the people in Britain aren't perhaps quite as enthusiastic as their political class is about this affair. But I don't want to interrupt, Robert.
I was just going to say, in terms of polling. The fact that they're starting to poll replacing Biden, they did a poll in New Hampshire that showed Buttigieg would crush Biden. This is a sign that the media and the deep state want to dump the albatross that is Biden before 2024, or at least on the 2024 ticket. So that part is still true. The hurdle is still Kamala Harris. You still have one of the most disliked people in the country. Every poll shows she does worse than Biden against Trump or anyone else that could be the nominee in 2024. So that's still their hurdle. They could try to Agnew her, like somebody asked a super chat about what I think about Tucker Carlson talking about what Watergate was really about. Some of us have long had that theory, and I've actually proposed it in one of the hush hushes. Was that the deep throat was deep state? In fact, I challenged Ben Bradley, the publisher of the Washington Post, or the editor of the Washington Post, way back on that topic when I was a young Yale student at a event in D.C. I said, what if the real reason you're not talking about Deep Throat isn't because he's a great whistleblower, but because he's someone who would embarrass your coverage, because he was someone who would compromise confidence in your coverage because his motive might not have been so pure. And Bradley just smirked and didn't respond any further. Of course, it turned out to be Mark Felt. Mark Felt ran COINTELPRO. Mark Felt was one of Hoover's key boys. And it was Nixon's attempt to de-Hooverize the FBI that led the deep state to take him out. Now, Nixon facilitated that along the way in 100 different ways, but there's no question it was the deep state wasn't going to accept any degree of replacement of their people in positions of power, even if it was done by someone like Nixon, who was often allied with deep state priorities on a wide range of international policy, including continuing the Vietnam War long after it made any sense or served any political obtainable purpose. So I agree with that aspect. But I think that what the deep state did to Nixon, before they took out Nixon, they took out Agnew. Spiro Agnew, the vice president, more of kind of a populist kind of guy in his own way, at least rhetorically. He wasn't going to deal with the nattering nabombs of negativism. And so if the system is going to try to take out Biden, look for them to try to take out Harris first somehow. If I was Kamal, I wouldn't be taking any Ron Brown specials of commerce to do some commerce business or vice presidential business in a war-torn region. Just word to the wise. But this also does, going back to Agnew, one of his speechwriters is a man who just announced his retirement. The one and only Patrick J. Buchanan, who wrote me years ago when I was trying to get him to run for president as an independent candidate in 2000. He ended up actually doing so with the Reform Party ticket. But Buchanan's legacy, to me, is most intriguing because it reflects the trajectory of conservative populism in American politics. That before the Cold War, Pat Buchanan type conservatism was deeply anti-war, anti-intervention. The deep state did a brilliant job of using the perceived threat of communism to justify and be a fig leaf for bad deep state priorities around the world. So magically, anybody that was an opponent of the Dulles brothers was now a commie, whether they were a commie or not, whether the origin, and they almost created their own reality. Because if you're, say, leading a peasant movement in Central America or a anti-colonial revolution in Asia or Africa, that would be the reason the deep state in the U.S. would oppose you. But because the deep state in the U.S. was opposing you, you would have to turn to the Soviet Union for financial and military support, creating their own reality of these being communist-inspired revolutions, when often, if you dug into the history, very rarely were they, in fact, communist-inspired revolutions. They're often just peasant revolts, anti-colonial revolts, revolts against the local corruption of the government, stealing their resources from the people for foreign corporations or governments. And so, but Buchanan reflected, I remember telling people in the late 80s that when the Cold War is over, and you could already see the signs of it then with Glasnost and Perestroika and the rest, I was like, you're going to see the return of anti-war populist conservatism on the right. I remember people saying, "Oh, you're nuts. You're crazy. These people love, every war in the world." Blah, blah, blah. And as you pointed out, Reagan actually, people look deeply. Reagan mostly avoided many wars. Reagan didn't give us Korea. Reagan didn't give us Vietnam. Reagan didn't give us World War I or World War II. As Bob Dole famously said in the 1976 vice presidential debate with Gerald Ford, if I could count all the dead from all the Democrat wars, it's one of my favorite lines of Bob Dole. That was the tradition, and Buchanan brought it back fiercely. As soon as the Cold War was over, he became one of the leading anti-interventionist, anti-foreign war voices on the conservative populist right. Challenged Poppy Bush in 1992, in part on an anti-war, anti-intervention ticket. That fed into Perot, who ran on what Perot kept saying is, let's all agree, no blood for oil. That was a deeply populist message, got almost over 20% of the vote. At one point was leading in the polls in 1992. Then Buchanan would stay as an influence in 96 and 2000 and would remain it started to shift the perspective of many people on the political right back to their populist, war skeptical, anti-foreign intervention roots. So I get Buchanan's controversial on a wide range of topics and subjects, but in my opinion, his most impactful legacy was reminding the conservative right that America was founded being opposed to foreign entanglements, being opposed to foreign wars, being opposed to building an empire, not being the minions of the deep state.
Absolutely. Can I just say, I mean, on this point about anti-war feeling, I mean, I read a long study. I did American politics. It was one of my big studies at university. And I remember going through all the demographic statistical data about who actually opposed the Vietnam War. And it's completely different from what most people think. If you're talking about, what sections of American society were opposed to the Vietnam War, the first people who spoke out against it were Republican conservatives. I mean, in Congress. It was the Democrats all basically supported it. There were just one or two who didn't, Fulbright and people like that. But basically, the main critics in Congress were conservative Republicans. And if you're going outside in the general country, it was conservative, working class people, mostly people, of above a certain age as well. This whole idea that it was student radicals and young people going out protesting, well, they might have been the people that you see in the pictures, but they were not by any means the primary demographic that opposed the war. And not only that, but that working class, that solid working class constituency that opposed the Vietnam War remained steady right through. They were the people who provided the numbers. They might not have been very, demonstrative about it. They might not have been very vocal, but they were completely consistent about this. And whom did they vote for? Well, many of them, very large proportion of them were Republicans and conservatives and American patriots, but they did not see any reason why the United States should be involved in a war in Southeast Asia. And when you say about, who started all the big wars, Vietnam, of course, was a Democrat war, ultimately. It's a Democrat administration. And of course, Ukraine is a Democrat war and a Democrat administration. And Syria and Libya were also Democrat wars. That was where it all began. Yes, Iraq was the Republicans, but Ronald Reagan actually didn't start any big wars. He had an awful lot of rhetoric, but he was always very, very careful. He always knew how far to go and when to stop. He never lost control of what he was doing, and he never let himself be pushed into doing things that he thought ultimately would be dangerous and reckless for the United States. So I think that's a point that perhaps people don't fully understand about American politics and about recent American politics. But I remember reading all this, going through all these studies as a student. And as I said, it was an eye-opener. I've never forgotten it. And it's if you understand that point about where the real anti-war opposition in America comes, and everything that I've seen since, by the way, is consistent with those early studies, well, that makes you understand an awful lot more about American politics since then. So I think that's absolutely right. I think what you said is completely true. As I said, a certain type of conservative Christian American didn't like communism with its atheism, its materialism, its collectivism, all of those things, and understandably why. But they were never particularly keen on interventionism at any point. And, they went along with a lot of the policies at one time. But since communism left the scene, they've not really been into it at all. And it was inevitable. It was absolutely logical that it would come. And Buchanan, no doubt, has played a part, but he's representative of the forces which have always been there. So I just wanted to say that. Now, there's a number of quick things I wanted to say. You mentioned Boris Johnson, who's, of course, wonderful British clown, if I can say that. I don't know whether you're aware of the fact, Robert, that he criticised Tucker Carlson before the Atlantic Council, this appalling, hideous Neocon think tank, outfit, lobby group, whatever, just after he'd agreed to appear on Tucker Carlson's program and then scarpered off. he said, who's afraid of Tucker Carlson? Well, it turns out Boris Johnson is, because he didn't dare go on Tucker Carlson's program. That gives you a sense of the kind of person Johnson is and the chutzpah of the man, because as I say, he runs away and then poses as the great hero, the person who is not really afraid of Tucker Carlson. And it's extraordinary how people still get taken in by it. And of all the people that the Atlantic Council could have chosen, to peddle this kind of message, they had to choose Boris Johnson. I mean, that is desperate, if I have to say. Now, desperate is another word that comes to mind about another thing that you brought out, which is the Stormy Daniels affair. If you're really going to go after Donald Trump over Stormy Daniels, well, all I can say is you are being very desperate indeed. I mean, this is the most investigated man, I think, in American history. He's had his taxes looked at. I mean, do you remember all that business about, his tax returns, the dark, terrible secrets that we were going to find in his tax returns? We now can all see them. Well, is anything there? Well, not really. I mean, it just does all the kind of things that, very rich people do, which is no different from what he does. So tax returns, nothing. Classified documents. Well, they're all doing it too. Pence did it. Biden did it. Everybody's apparently doing it. But, so Trump did it, and he was the president. He can declassify anything he wants, and he has it all in a safe, in a safe, secure building where, there's CCTV and guards. Well, where does Scranton Joe keep his classified documents? In his garage next to it. What's the car called, Alex? I can never remember. The Corvette next to his 1960s Corvette. Anybody can wander around. Of course, his son is floating around too, and we know what a reliable keeper of secrets he is. So, I mean, so that's gone down in smoke. We're not going to talk about Russiagate because, frankly, that's a bitter story. But every conceivable allegation, investigation that they launched against Trump, all I can say about Trump, I said it before, he must be the most honest businessman in the property business in America. I mean, I know a bit about property business in Britain, and I know the kind of, corners these people cut and the kind of things they do and what a rough trade it is. The fact that they have found nothing against Trump literally astonishes me. I have to say, the only conclusion I can come to is that this man, who's been so investigated and so relentlessly investigated, must be fundamentally clean. Now, that's something that people don't like to hear. I've tried to explain this to many people in Britain, that, you talk all the time about Donald Trump, you talk about his corruption, you talk about his flamboyance. You don't know what you're talking about. If he really was corrupt, we would have the evidence by now. We'd have the real prosecutions. They wouldn't be scrabbling up to set up silly committees with, what's her name, Cheney and all those people on them, coming up with ridiculous reports that, frankly, nobody who has any idea about how prosecutions are conducted would possibly read and think that there was even a figment of a case there. So Donald Trump comes across to me as clean. I am surprised. If anybody had told me 6-7 years ago that he was as clean as he was, I wouldn't have believed them. I'd say impossible to succeed in the kind of business that he does. and not to have done some pretty dodgy things. Well, it turns out that he didn't. And if you want to resurrect the Stormy Daniels business, well, all I can say is good luck to you. I'm pretty sure whatever he did there are the kind of things that any number of people in Congress, in the White House, in Washington, in every state capital of the United States. And I'm not going to even start about what's going on in London at the moment, where I'm hearing appalling stories about what's going on in Westminster. I mean, really appalling stories about what is going on in Westminster. I mean, the word I've heard, by the way, is that corruption and hedonism now in political circles in London is completely out of control. Well, compared to that, Stormy Daniels is absolutely nothing. It's a zero. It's not a crime, not by any conceivable stretch of the imagination. And as for these payments, as I understand it, he basically took legal advice. It only turned out that the lawyer that he trusted to give him that advice was a crook. So where's the problem? I mean, that lawyer was a crook, but Trump wasn't. I mean, the whole thing is just absurd.
Well, I often tell clients, approach hiring a lawyer like you would a doctor. You wouldn't go to the local Medicaid clinic for an important medical treatment proceeding. Why are you going to go to your local strip mall to hire your lawyer? You're going to end up with the Michael Cohens of the world. But Trump couldn't help himself. He always thinks lawyers are getting one over on him. He wanted to go cheap, and he paid the price for it. I guess it's not surprised Biden's classified documents were in the garage. They probably weren't far from the ice cream freezer. That's all he needed to worry about. But, it is a sad world where Boris Johnson, of the great British debating tradition, of the Oxford Union tradition, is scared to show up and just chat for a little while with Tucker Carlson. But it does make sense the Atlantic would invite him, because if you're going to invite a clown, the nice thing about Johnson is you don't even need, you just need a little makeup, because he's already got the hair ready to go. So, in terms of just the insanity of all of that. But to understand kind of Trump, in terms of a lot of rhetoric on the Ukraine and other issues, I always tell people clearly money wasn't his driving motivation, because he's the only person since Kennedy to lose money while holding office. So everyone else is getting fabulously rich. Liz Cheney, fabulously rich. The Pelosi's have the best stock. If you could have been a part of the Pelosi investment fund, you would have made the best rate of return of anybody in Wall Street the last 30 years. Your rate of returns would have been so good, you would have welcomed the stalker with a nice little cocktail drink when the police show up at the scene. Still with a cocktail drink in hand. Guy's got a hammer. You got one hand on the hammer and one hand on a cocktail drink. Who gets it? Who gets a cocktail drink when someone's got a hammer next to you? Paul Pelosi, apparently. But I think Trump sort of reversed Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt said, talk softly and carry a big stick. Trump is talk big and carry a peace treaty. And if people understand that way, they can predict what he would be like if he's able to get back into office. But to your point about the anti-war streak in American politics, a great example of this is Wisconsin. I was arguing recently with people who were telling me, no, we got to support DeSantis because DeSantis is the only one that can win. And it's like, have you not paid attention prior to 2016? Democrats were so strong in the working class industrial North that the media took to calling it their blue wall. It was so impregnable and vulnerable. Paul Ryan, as a Wisconsinite on the ticket, lost to Barack Obama by 7 points, 4 points more than the national margin. Democrats had outperformed Republicans in Wisconsin consistently through since the Great Depression in almost every election, including McGovern and Mondale in 72 and 84, who are much more competitive there than they were nationally. But what you find is a strong anti-war streak in Wisconsin. So, you find 1940, 1944, Democrats ran into more trouble than they did elsewhere. Why? Because of concern of World War I. You see, Wisconsin was a hotbed of anti-Vietnam War activity in the 1960s. It was a place that, someone like LBJ would have had no chance had he run in 1968 against either Bobby Kennedy or Eugene McCarthy. Now, Wisconsin's a place where George Wallace surprised people with some primary votes. But what they didn't realize is if you polled those same Wallace voters, their second favorite candidate was Robert Francis Kennedy Jr., or Sr., running at that point on anti-Vietnam War, anti-war platform. Wisconsin 2004 was a place that around the country, Bush did 3 points better than he did in 2000. Not in Wisconsin, he did worse. Why? Because the Norwegians that dominate Western Wisconsin are notoriously anti-war, as are some of the German Americans and other groups in the northern woods of Wisconsin. Trump was the first one to break through. Wisconsin was more Republican than the rest of the country because he could combine a coalition of working class voters in the industrial Southeast with the anti-war voters of the Southwest, with the old lumberjack country that birthed both Fighting Bob La Follette and Joe McCarthy, the northern woods of Wisconsin. And they gave us both of those guys, which tells you something about the very deep populist streak and how it can go in different directions. That's why really only Trump poses a threat to the deep state in 2024. They don't believe, either they believe, DeSantis and others will be in their pocket. Nikki Haley clearly would, or they think that none of them can win anyway against the Democratic deep state pick candidate because of the lack of appeal. The way Trump broke through was on two issues: better trade policy to help an industrial policy to rebuild America's old manufacturing base, much as kind of the Brexit pitch was partially pitched up in the Midlands in that part of the UK, but also being anti-war. There was, in fact, the biggest, strongest correlation was if you looked at a county that had the highest number of fatalities since 2001 in Afghanistan and Iraq, you also saw the biggest swing from Obama 2012 to Trump 2016. It was almost extraordinarily how correlated those two were. And that's why they want to take Trump out, is his dissident opinions on those topics. But it looks like their other agenda, going back to Andrew Tate, going back to a range of other topics, was that thought experiment you guys went into on what the heck was happening, putting together a fascinating sequence of events, kind of hush-hush style. It's like the history episodes you guys done in the past. You could probably do your own locals version of a hush-hush type alternative histories, because I hadn't even put those pieces together at all until you guys did. And then I was like, oh, wow, that fits at so many levels, in that you have the meeting at Davos where the ambassador or the one of the top Lithuania, I think it was foreign secretary, was there promoting the Ukrainian conflict. Not long after Davos, the World Economic Forum, the CIA director has a compelling need to visit Kiev, and I don't think it was for the borscht. I think he was, and then not long after that, we get a sense of what he was there for, because suddenly we got interior secretaries going down in unexplained helicopter crashes. Suddenly we got major media people being kicked out and dismissed. We suddenly got people talking about needing to flee to Israel or somewhere else with a bunch of Western cash in tow. Suddenly half of the Ukrainian administration and key officials are getting purged. And then at the same time, you have, as you guys pointed out, the Hungarians being targeted for conscription and being sent to the most dangerous part, the Hungarians, that the ethnic group that's within Ukraine, to the front lines. And what's being reported is they're dying at a disparate rate. And then you add why are we sending tanks that Ukraine can't use anytime soon in the name of Ukraine, whether it's Leopards or Abrams? And then, of course, you look it up, and the Poles, of course, have been training on Abrams for a little while. And I always find fascinating. There was this guy, actual justice warrior, who's one of these sort of right-wing culture commentators. And he was on recently with a show with a buddy of mine, Good Logic, a lawyer guy. And they were just getting into a little bit of the Ukrainian conversation. And he was explaining how he had heard these stories about Bandera being a bad guy, but he looked it up, and Bandera was imprisoned by the Nazis, so he couldn't be a neo-Nazi. And it's like, no, they locked them up because they went even crazier than the Nazis did in Western Ukraine. It's probably why Israel and Israelis are not real eager to send military aid to Ukraine. It's not just about not wanting to get sideways with Russia while they're sideways with Iran, but also not necessarily help some people that at least a few folks in Israel still have memories of what the Ukrainian nationalists did when they got power allied with the Nazis before even the Nazis were like, whoa, that's even much for us. I mean, that's how bad some of those guys were in the purges they did in Western Ukraine. Some of the worst images we have from those kind of purges in World War II come from what the Ukrainian nationalists did. But I get a sense of where that perspective is. But when you guys combine that sequence, I was like the most logical explanation. And then you see Jordan Peterson in there and drone attacks on Iran and escalation in that field. Though I think you guys' analysis is it makes the most sense by far to me, which was this was an effort to take out Iranian providing drone technology and drone support to Russia in the Ukrainian conflict, which I'm sure Netanyahu is happy to do because he's obsessed with bombing Iran anyway. That's something I've never quite understood the Israeli angle on. I was like, I get it, existential threat. Iranians chant, death to Israel. I get that part of it. But how is destabilizing Iran and escalating conflict going to solve your problem? How did that work in Iraq? How did that work in Syria? How did that work in Libya? Not well, maybe. But we'll see with all that. But I thought that sequence of events, you put it together, the most logical explanation is partitioning. And it was reminded me of listening to this guy, this actual Justice Warrior guy, completely butcher what's happening in Ukraine. I realize how many people don't know the whole Polish-Lithuanian history in Ukraine. That the Polish-Lithuanian Empire dominated Ukraine for longer than the Russians dominated Eastern Ukraine. I mean, that goes way, way back in terms of the alliances there. And God bless these Polish nationalists who now have power in Poland. But you can tell there's some of them that, they'd like to, get back into business. And then when I see the Lithuanians, it's like, what do they want to do? Recreate the Polish-Lithuanian Empire all over again? I'm sure some Germans aren't thrilled about that idea.
No.
But I think your analysis that this was more putting a plan in place for the possibility of partitioning Ukraine as the backup plan to when the Russian troops start waving in. Talk now of 500,000 Russian troops doing a major assault. There was a Ukrainian military official today saying that they believe that they're going to attack also from the Black Sea and start going into Odessa in that region soon. That the backup plan is partition Ukraine, divvy it up, and the Poles want to recreate a little bit of the Polish-Lithuanian Empire all over again. Though you got to wonder how that worked out for them last time they tried, because Bandera was initially in prison for his terrorism against the Poles, not against the Russians or the Jews. But I thought that analysis put together a lot of things that otherwise didn't make a lot of sense. What do you guys think currently, given the updates from the last time you guys talked about that?
I'm going to say, first of all, can I say thanks for that, Rob? And can I just say, we went through that thought process. It was entirely spontaneous. We did it over the course of the program. Well, a lot of things are happening now, and they're all very interesting. The first thing to say is that the purge in Kiev is continuing. And the person who's now being targeted, and the big target now, is the defense minister, a man called Reznikov, Alexander Reznikov. There's now a petition to have him removed, and there's increasing talk that he is going to be removed. He's pretty close to Zelensky, by the way. So it does seem to me increasingly that it is Zelensky's supporters who are being steadily and systematically picked off. Started with his spin doctor, Arestovich, who's now gone completely off-piste. He's now saying Ukraine is losing the war. It's going to lose the war. There's no real chance of we going to win. Has to be very careful what he says because he's still in Kiev. And by the way, just for your information, he's an ethnic Russian. He was born in Georgia, but like the head of the Ukrainian ground forces, who's General Syrskyi, he's also a Russian from Vladimir, which is in a town near Moscow, and he studied in the Moscow Higher Command School during the Soviet Union. Just saying these little details which most people aren't aware of. But anyway, so Reznikov is now clearly a target. Igor Kolomoisky, who's a big league oligarch in Ukraine. I mean, you might even have come across him, Robert, in your legal work because his tentacles are everywhere. Well, he's widely believed to have been the person who basically controlled Zelensky at one time and who sponsored him in his political career. And Kolomoisky is now under investigation. His house was searched by the Ukrainian security police. Now, I have to say, all of this accumulating now, and it really does look to me as if the ultimate target now is definitely Zelensky. And I think Zelensky is the kind of person who would not go along with a plan to partition Ukraine like that. I mean, his position has been so much about fighting for every conceivable inch of Ukrainian territory that for him to agree to some kind of partition plan, I can't see politically how he could do it. So I think he's both erratic, volatile, nuts. In fact, I mean, he's bonkers, to say it bluntly. I mean, some of his speeches, some of his comments recently. I mean, he's now, by the way, talking about Ukraine needs 400 tanks and 200 fighter jets from the West. I mean, you know, you give him more, he doesn't ask for more. He asks for much, much more. And then he asks for even more beyond that. And he says increasingly weird things. So I think he's becoming increasingly unstable and eccentric. But I think he's also a problem towards a move now to try and find some solution to this war. Because the most interesting thing is we're now starting to see more and more admissions in more and more places that the war is lost. And I mean, there was even a report today in The Guardian, of all places, the first time I've seen a Western media outlet, for example, admitting that the Ukrainians are now mobilizing people by grabbing them in the streets. The Guardian actually reported that today. I mean, that's astonishing. I mean, that's something I've never seen before. But on top and beyond that, there's been three big reports. One is one by the Rand Corporation. And Robert, you know exactly what the Rand Corporation is, one of the most sinister and frightening organizations on planet Earth. But anyway, they said US interests are not served by a prolonged war. Ukraine is not winning the war. It can't achieve a breakthrough. It cannot retake Crimea. The only prospect, the best prospect, if the war continues, is a stalemate, which is contrary to US interests because it might escalate out of control, and it is eating up our military reserves and is destabilizing not just the global economy, but particularly the economies of our European allies. So our interests are not served by a prolonged war. We have to start looking for some kind of way out. So that was the Rand Corporation. Then there's this other organization, the CSIS, which Alex is always reminding me what the stands for. But my sense of that is that that's the military industrial complex. And it turns out you were absolutely right about this, Robert. You said months ago that the military industrial complex would not like to see its weapons used in Ukraine because it's bad for business to see Abrams tanks and F-16 fighter jets, you know, being blown up on the battlefields. And in fact, whenever there's a new arms delivery, and this is something I was completely unaware of, it was pointed out to me. In fact, every time there's a big arms delivery, I was expecting that, you know, their share prices would rise. Actually, they tend to dip, and overall, they haven't been doing that well this last year. I mean, their share prices are falling further, and of course, they're under a lot of stress, and they're not getting the orders that they expected because the order book was supposed to be $30 billion to, you know, make up for all of these weapons that have been expended. So far, they've only been given orders for $10 billion. Sounds like a lot, but for them, it's not. And they're having problems. They're having strains. They don't like to see their weapons used in this kind of war. Their ideal war is a very expensive war against a pitifully weak opponent, which, you know, makes lots of money, but, you know, there isn't going to be any real prospect of seeing your aircraft being destroyed or your tanks being destroyed. That's good for business. This kind of war is not ultimately good for business. The CSIS says US military-industrial complex is not yet ready to start churning out the weapons and the vast numbers that would be needed. You know, we need to turn it round. We need a 5-10 year window to do that in. And of course, we don't have a 5 to 10 year window in Ukraine. And lastly, that's the most intriguing report of all from the International Monetary Fund. And can I just say, everybody got it wrong except the three people who are engaged in this discussion, because this is about Russia. Everybody said Russian economy, paper tiger, gas station masquerading as a country. It's going to be cratered by the sanctions. They're going to suffer a 20% GDP contraction. They're going to have hyperinflation. The ruble is going to become rubble. Well, the IMF now has suddenly revised its outlook for the Russian economy in 2023. In October, they were saying it was going to suffer a 2.3% contraction, which already is far less than was being claimed elsewhere. But in just a few months, they've revised that, and they've now said that it's going to achieve growth. So it's not going to collapse. Russia is not going to collapse. Our industries, our military industrial industries are under strain. The economies of our allies are under strain. The military situation isn't going well. And we have to find some way of ending this war. And I was reading an article in Politico just shortly before we did this program, all very interesting. Military people coming along to Congress, speaking to the House Armed Services Committee. They say there's no real prospect of Ukraine being able to recapture Crimea. Well, I'm sure that's a huge surprise to the three of us. But anyway, it's now the military, the uniform, always important to stress, the uniformed military saying these things. And at the same time, I read this man, I think his name was Rogers, Mike Rogers, you probably know him, probably a neocon to the hue, you know, died in the world neocon, but he says this war has to end by the summer. We can't let it go on beyond the summer. And it looks like Ukraine isn't going to get Crimea back, and they've got to start asking themselves in Ukraine, what does victory mean? Because there's no way that Russia's going to give up Crimea. No way Russia's going to give up other territory. So since it's got to end by the summer, what does that sound like? It sounds like he's talking about some kind of way of bringing this to an end. But of course, what they're talking about is not the kind of peace agreement that perhaps the three of us would like to see. They want to see some kind of resolution to this conflict that will let them move on to the next place, the next war, if you like. So partition between Russia and Poland of Western Ukraine, Poland taking over Western Ukraine, trying to send the Polish military in to Western Ukraine. I have to say, all the pieces are falling into place, and you can see some of the motivations. There's one big problem with this, which has already emerged. And that, interestingly, is in Poland itself. Many people in Poland are very unhappy. Many people in the Polish military are very unhappy. And the level of resignations of professional soldiers and officers from the Polish military is now apparently reaching catastrophic levels. So they have to do it fast and soon, whilst there's a Polish army still to do it.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that, you know, if they know their history, integrating that region won't necessarily go over so well. And we've already seen some of the conflict with just Ukrainian migrants to Poland at some of the culture conflicts that evolve from that. The military-industrial complex and the neocons have an amazing ability to have complete amnesia about their failures. Because if they were smart at this point, they would say, maybe we shouldn't recreate Korea or Vietnam. Those are very good analogies, by the way, how we handled the Vietnam regime and how that was the deep state behind changing the regime, shifting the regime, pretending that that would solve the problems, the different purges the U.S. sponsored in the South Vietnamese government, etc. But, you know, Korea didn't work, Vietnam didn't work, Iraq didn't work, Libya didn't work, Syria didn't work, Afghanistan didn't work. that what we needed, if the deep state or the military industrial complex wanted some good advertising for those over expenditures on various defense projects, is give another Grenada, another Panama, not another Beirut or anything like it. But they clearly have not learned their lesson. I mean, Reagan did. Reagan figured, okay, this isn't working Beirut. We're out of there. But hey, don't worry. The militaristic side of my base, we'll take back Grenada from the commies who've taken over the university or whatever it was. It was supposedly our excuse for going in there. Very wag the doggish that was. Not as wag the doggish as what Bill Clinton did, where he took the literal script from Wag the Dog to go into Yugoslavia. He's like, where people forget, Wag the Dog, where did they fake the war? Albania. That's where they faked the war. They even had, people going through the snow as fake refugees. And then I remember watching a CNN episode that supposedly had refugees going through the snow. And I was like, there's no snow this time of year. It was classic Clinton, a little wink and a nod to let people know what he was really capable of in the middle of a sex scandal, no less. Also because these people look at these old scripts and they think they're scripts for doing things. It's like when they brought in Zelensky, they're like, what could we use for good presentation? Oh, 1984. Yeah, we'll use a 1984 backdrop. That's really impressive. That was really impressive in the movie. It's unbelievable. But, you can understand Zelensky in terms of wanting more. He figures if you got a line of Coke, clearly you got a kilo of Coke you can give him. It's the same mindset and mentality. But as to Igor, that started a couple of years ago in the U.S. So Igor helped fund a lot of the crazy militias, the hooligans and the neo-Nazis who became actual militias, who then became part of the Azov battalions, then became infiltrated into the Interior Secretary and even to large aspects of the Ukrainian military architecture. A lot of it was funded by Igor, even though Igor is Jewish, because Igor cares about what Igor cares about. He cares a lot more than he cares about his Jewish identity in terms of promoting certain politics. Then he helps bankroll Zelensky's entire media career, then parlays it into politics. Not long after Zelensky wins, Igor wanted Zelensky to unfreeze certain key bank accounts, certain banks of funds that were frozen. And basically, Igor made the mistake of thinking he was the boss of Zelensky, not the deep state. And the U.S. at that time, though it was relatively low-key, not a lot of media attention, brought several actions in the United States against Igor's assets here. And it was the beginning of a message to Igor: you work for us, we don't work for you. And Zelensky works for us, Zelensky doesn't work for you. Igor kind of backed off, but never fully backed off. Now, he did take a plane to Israel to be extradition free. So Igor got that part of the message. He's like, I'm out of here. Like, apparently several others are like, Igor did it. That's where I'll do it. Like one of the defense officials or whatever, supposedly running with all the cash, trying to get to Israel, saying, hey, I'm Jewish all along. Just protect me now. So it's not a surprise. But Igor, because he had that prior history, it would be just like the deep state to say, this is a key guy we got to remove. We got to make sure his allies and his finances don't prop up Zelensky, so Zelensky understands he's completely dependent on us. Indeed, if you go back to when they went after Igor, it was not long after Zelensky started making peace-type statements after he first got in. People forget the guy ran on a peace ticket. He's going to bring peace to Ukraine. Unbelievable. The guy's just he's a coked-up actor who now is scared and confused about where his world is. Doesn't know which script he's supposed to be in, and is flipping back and forth. And so it was after he went to Donbass, and other places, was threatened by various Azov battalion people for some of his statements there about maybe we can work something out. Not long after, all of a sudden, the U.S. Department of Justice initiates 2 asset freezer actions against Igor, and then a month later, Zelensky's singing a different tune on the Donbass. Let's not worry about those Minsk Accords, as they've now all admitted were just a crock to begin with. So a show to buy time. But as to your economic question, absolutely that the big gamble that they could use this conflict as an excuse to show that Kissinger's hierarchy of power was right. And it turned out, and that Putin's thesis that he advanced all the way back to his economic thesis in the late 1990s, which was, this Kissinger was, if you control food, you control people. If you control fuel, you control countries. But if you control money, you control the world. And globalists believe they control the financial system, so they could dictate to Vladimir Putin terms. And it wasn't just to prove that to Putin in Russia. and recolonialize the country by the Western elites, but also to show the whole rest of the world. See, this guy stuck his head up and we whacked him. So you better get in line. Now, of course, it's all backfired. That's why Kissinger has been screaming from very early on, okay, this didn't work out. Time to get out. Time to exit, because he didn't want to see his whole thesis proven false. That Putin's old thesis that no, it's fuel and food and military power that matter. Your money is just pieces of papers and digits on a screen. And it only represents something to the degree it represents actual military, food, or fuel. And we in Russia, we got a lot of those three, food, fuel, and military power. He's been proven right. And I always thought they were less aggressive in the military conflict than anticipated, because he was worried about the opinion of the global South, because he needed the global South to be aligned with him to win the economic war being waged against him. Now that that's fading, I don't think he's as worried about that now as he was then. Russia's probably going to start taking off more and more gloves in how they attack and how they deal with things. Probably see more airfare, continued attacks on the Ukrainian energy system, and probably much more aggressive military actions. Given if the premonitions of either Scott Ritter or Doug McGregor or others are right, that they're planning on a major assault, or what we're seeing in the news being reported today. But on the economic side, what's fascinating is I've been exploring this thesis that someone by the name of Jeff Snyder, Eurodollar University, has. And his theory is that the financial system, the central banks, lost control of the global financial system in the post-war era. And his theory is that what happened is the dollar had the sufficient elasticity to maintain a global economy in an international age. And that tons of countries and private banks started issuing currency. In other words, I think it's $65 trillion in dollar-denominated debt around the world. It's only like $4 trillion actually in print. So we have a mismatch. And that the Federal Reserve and the central banks, even the ECB, since its establishment, have been trying to maintain this illusion that they can control monetary policy, that they can still shape it, and that there's been these glimpses in the long-term capital collapse and the NASDAQ.com bubble and the so-called housing bubble and the great financial crisis. There's glimpses that they can't, that they want to, but they have nowhere near the control they think they do. What they can do is help sink their economy domestically by whether it's crazy economic sanctions policies in Europe on energy from Russia, or it's in the U.S., where one key aspect of the U.S. economy is housing, because people use it to borrow against the equity, not sell the home, borrow against it at low interest rates to fund discretionary investment and income and spending. The problem is that's going to collapse as the interest rates spike. So all of a sudden, this big source of discretionary income is gone. All the stimmy checks are gone. All of the pandemic spending, for the most part, is gone. So the demand is going to start to go down, and it's going to be interpreted as reducing inflation, when what's really happening is people just aren't buying as much. In December, in both the U.S. and Germany, they saw unusual drops in consumer spending. And what the Fed may do and the ECB with them, I agree with Tom Longo that there's kind of conflict there. But what they may do is not actually control the monetary system issues that are now kind of beyond their control, but instead sink both the European and domestic U.S. economies in ways that could create all kinds of political turmoil in the upcoming elections in both continents. And meanwhile, I think another reason why the global South wants to divorce itself from the U.S. dollar isn't just the political weaponization by the United States of the dollar that they've revealed in the attacks on Russia, though I think that accelerated the timetable for their action, is that the problem in so much global denominated debt is that when the dollar value goes up, the cost of that debt goes up. And what it's doing, the economic officials for the part of the Indian government have been talking about this, it jeopardizes everybody around the world. Suddenly, something that's designed to deal with inflation in the United States ends up doing economic damage to global GDP, to global growth, to global labor force participation rates, much of which has never fully recovered from the global financial crisis. So I think that the fact, it reminds me a lot of the 1920s, that in the 19 teens, the combination of disastrous military geopolitical strategy that led to the collapse within 4 years of the Russian Empire, German Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, empires that had lasted centuries, then was succeeded by banking and financial mismanagement that gave us a financial collapse, that gave us the rise of both totalitarian regimes under the name of communism and totalitarian regimes under the name of fascism, which then ultimately birthed one of the worst wars in the history of humankind. And so I think our risk factor continues to escalate while some idiots in the State Department want to start a war in Iran and want to start a war in Pentagon because the Defense Department, because the military industrial complex thinks they need better advertising, and because neocons have their own version of Gellerman amnesia, that they forget all of the litany and litter of mistakes and failures in the past half century.
I completely agree with all of that. Can I just add, by the way, that one of the great tragedies of modern history and one of the great mistakes that was made was the decision in 1944 at Bretton Woods to make the dollar the international reserve currency. Keynes, I know many people have very strong feelings about John Maynard Keynes, and I'm not here to defend him, but he did warn against it. He said this is not a good idea. And, look at the economic position of the United States in the period just after the Second World War. It was far more dominant at that time in terms of manufacturing than China is today or will ever be. The United States by itself accounted for something like 60% of world manufacturing output in the period just after the Second World War. GDP, I'm not even going to try and remember what the figures there were. Gold reserves, they were colossal. What happened with making the dollar the reserve currency, which of course had various iterations? There's the first pure Bretton Woods iteration where all the currencies are pegged to the dollar and the dollar is pegged to gold, at least in terms of international trade. Well, that at a stroke meant that the United States opened its markets to its so-called allies. So you saw the enormous expansion of the European economies by selling goods to the United States. The United States starts to run a structural deficit. With respect to the European economies, it gets much worse in the 1960s when US factories are having to be committed to sustaining war production, both for the global arms race with the Soviet Union and to fight the war in Vietnam. So we have the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1971 because it's unsustainable. There isn't enough. They started to get worried about gold being shipped to France and all those kind of things. So Bretton Woods is unsustainable, but they still keep the dollar as the reserve currency. They now use oil as, they create the petrodollar. They create all kinds of other mechanisms and devices and all sorts of things. But the underlying point of all of this is this colossal manufacturing, industrial, technological, scientific machine that is the United States, with its enormous, enormously highly educated, highly trained workforce that you have in the 1940s and early 1950s. It is gradually being frittered away because it's carrying on its shoulders the burden of sustaining the dollar. Now, this is something people don't understand. They always assume that empire benefits the imperial nation. It benefits some people within the imperial nation. The majority carry the burden of empire upon their shoulders. Britain, which had been the great workshop of the world in the 19th century, it steadily lost its industrial leadership. It's gradually deindustrialized. And you see exactly the same pattern happening to the United States because economic energy and political energy is being squandered trying to sustain these things. If the dollar loses its reserve currency position, Robert, you're absolutely right. At that point, central banks And you must understand that we're talking about the Fed, but it's really an alliance of central banks, all of which are working together to maintain the dollar system, which basically means moving vast sums of capital backwards and forwards. Much of it goes to New York, doesn't filter its way across the United States. Much of it stays there. That's why there is so much inequality in the United States at the moment, even as industrial energy, manufacturing energy has gradually dwindled away. But anyway, not only will that consortium of central banks lose power over the way the economic system is run, and bear in mind what they're trying to do is a kind of central planning spread out on a global way, which is, of course, what's also led to this whole these ideas of globalization. The WEF has got itself attached to all of that, but that's where that's all come from. The ability to control supposedly money flows through the dollar system. Not only will we see the end of that finally, but we will also, I believe, I always get criticized for saying this, we will see the United States, which is a different country from Britain, with a different political tradition and a different economic landscape and economic culture, finally liberated from this burden of carrying the dollar, the supremacy of the dollar, and all that implies. And yes, the United States will not be able to use its economic power to control, what goes on in West Africa, or interfere in Myanmar, or run things in the Philippines, or meddle in Libya, or start wars in Ukraine. Why is that a problem? Why is it anything else other than a burden on the American people when their government and their leadership is focused on those kind of things? So I think it will be a liberating event for the United States when it happens. And I remain absolutely convinced. In fact, I am sure that when it does happen, as it must, that at that point, all the underlying strengths of the United States will kick in. And after a certain period of turbulence, which there's bound to be, provided the constitutional settlement holds, we will see all of the underlying strengths of the United States reassert themselves. Now, I say this in many places. Most people I say them to, those that know about these things, economists, there are some intelligent economists, industrial leaders, people of that kind. I know quite a few of those agree with me. Many others don't. But that's my view. And I would, bet on it against any other.
Yeah, and I think, we see it in the U.S. Treasury markets when there's such a big yield inversion that people that are buying those 30-year bonds think that the economy is in serious trouble, or you wouldn't have a better rate on a 30-year than 3 months or 30 days, given the way things have gone. That you can get a better yield to a certain degree in the inverse way than it should be. And so that's a sign that some financially sophisticated actors do not have confidence in what the Federal Reserve is trying to spend to people, or what the European Central Bank is trying to spend to people. And it's a model that I think has failed. And the only question is, do we get a 1929 level global financial disaster to prove to the world what a disaster it is? Or does the global South do us a favor and divorce from it in order to salvage and save us from ourselves in terms of our elites? And I think you're absolutely right. Like, you're talking about the wars of today are not wars of that the ordinary people profit from. That it doesn't line their pockets; it empties their pockets. As the ancestors of my Tennessee neighbors said in response to the Civil War, ain't none of us going to be dying for no rich man's war. That's how they saw the Civil War. They weren't interested in the Confederacy, even if the rest of the state of Tennessee was. They were mountain folks who came to America to get away from war, not to engage in more of it. Now, speaking of desire for conflict, seeing the stories circulate now out of Germany, about admitting the Western source for the attack on Nord Stream 1 and 2 made me wonder whether Victoria Nuland's presentation is that, I thought it was a great headline you guys had on the episode. You're right. I ordered that code red, from one of the great lines of Jack Nicholson. I'm going to tear the eyes out of your head, piss into your dead skull. That was just one of the great. Apparently, Nicholson believed in it so much he kept doing it off camera. He loved that whole line. That set of lines. But you could tell Nuland was so eager to take credit. Yes, we took out Nord Stream 1 and 2. They should build a statue to me in Kiev and in Washington. And I almost wonder whether part of that aligned group within the State Department wants the Germans to come out and say the Americans did it. But my view is it's another place where there's a disconnect, because my assumption is that European public opinion would not take such a celebratory view of Nuland's action like Nuland thinks she would.
Absolutely. Can I just say you're absolutely right about that? I mean, first of all, Germany's now going into the recession. I mean, this is now, they've been trying to fiddle the figures. They've been passing off. We've discussed this, Alex and I've spoken about this with other people. They're passing off some inflation as growth. That's what they were doing last year. So it's a common trick. And again, Joe and his team, every kind of trick in the book they're going to play. I mean, we have to, and they're not going to, if there's a chance of massaging the economic figures that way, they'll do it. I mean, that's the kind of thing they will do. But nobody on the streets, nobody who's in work, nobody who's got a mortgage to pay, nobody who has the taxes to pay. Taxes are going up all over Europe. Nobody believes that. Nobody, because it's too discordant with their actual everyday life experiences. The fact is that consumer spending collapsed in Germany in December. GDP fell in the last quarter. All the indications are of an economy that's going into deep recession. German business, very, very angry deep down, and becoming more angry now about the fact that they've lost cheap energy from Russia. They're starting to really grasp, they're saying to themselves, what did we do? I mean, they've reached that level. They were swept along by the hysteria at the beginning, but now they're taking a step back and they're saying, what did we do? If Nuland comes along and says, we don't know who did it. Wink, wink, shove, shove. That's exactly, by the way, I should say, Robert, I remember you telling us on one of our live streams some months ago, shortly after it happened, that these people were aching to admit to their role in it. I remember it vividly. Absolutely, I remember it so clearly. And then we have Nuland. I mean, she comes along, she's almost aching to come out and tell everybody, yes, we thought it was all us. It was all us. Well, I can tell you for an absolute fact that is going to go down so badly in Germany if it ever comes out that, I mean, Nuland and co just don't know what's coming. The Germans are going to be furious. Already, you see the German opinion polls are saying, they weren't happy about the tanks. They're dead against the fighter jets. They're starting to get worried that the whole thing is getting out of control. If they discover that, it was the Americans who directly or otherwise were involved in what was, to be straightforward about it, a terrorist act against German economic infrastructure. That is going to go down so badly in Germany that you can't even start to talk about what the response is going to be. I would not personally be surprised if Scholz's government collapsed under the weight of the reaction. So, just bear that. I mean, Nuland doesn't understand Europe. I don't know that she understands the US very well either, by the way. I mean, remember, she's not an elected politician. She's never been elected to anything. She's always been appointed to various places. And of course, she's really somebody who doesn't, I think, have that feel for public opinion. I've been seeing opinion polls in the US. You said correctly that there aren't really that many opinion polls in the United States, just as there aren't in Britain at all, by the way. But the latest ones that I've seen say that more Americans now think that the US is giving too much to Ukraine as opposed to too little. They'd rather see it start to wind down. And I can't help but think that this is going to start to, this view is going to start to harden over the next few months. If there's economic problems in the US, if there's a recession in the US, and I agree, I think all the indications clearly point in that direction. I think that's going to happen in the US. But in Germany, if on top of the recession, on top of the tanks being sent to Ukraine, on top of Poland with the crazy ideas of its government of expanding Poland into Western Ukraine, if on top of all of that, they suddenly learned that, it was the Americans, or at least Vicky Nuland's gang, that blew up Nord Stream, well, that's going to go down. I mean, they'll be furious. I mean, that's all I will say.
Yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary at a time we're trying to declare the Wagner Group a criminal group so we can arrest them Victor Bout style. While Bout is actually doing his television interview series after being released in exchange for a WNBA player, caught with some vaping equipment and what have you. That she wants to brag about one of the biggest terroristic events that is state directed economically in recent times, the blowing up of Nord Stream 1 and 2. For people out there to give to wrap up the sort of Victoria Nuland component, guess who Christopher Steele's contact was at the State Department in promoting the Russiagate story? It was the one and only Victoria Nuland.
Really?
So
Yeah,
she was neck deep in the Russiagate complicity. She was one of the
she always, like a sort of something that smells very bad. She always turns up. That's all I can say.
Completely. Now, credit to the interesting. What did you guys think of the politician that's from the left that's now getting a lot of support from the right in Germany that Glenn Greenwald recently interviewed, in part using opposition to war in Ukraine and the rest as a way to build a cross-ideological base of support in contesting power there in Germany, in particular. And by the way, on the funding side, you're going to see the same thing pursued here in the U.S. That Senator Vance, one of his first things was he was calling for an immediate, full, transparent audit of the Ukrainian monies. And the reason he's doing that is twofold. One, the money going to Ukraine is not popular in the United States. And secondly, he knows that money is going to lead to a lot of black bag operations, and a lot of it is not going to have actually ended up in any Ukrainian war effort. And it would be very embarrassing for the deep state to have to expose where that deep state money really went. So look for Vance to continue to push on that angle. But is there promise now, and finally some German public official challenging the institutional narrative on these insane Ukrainian policies?
Absolutely. I think somebody just put up her name, but it's Sarah Wagenknecht, and I think she is indeed a strong political force. And it's, by the way, very interesting because she's come from Die Linke, which is the party of the left, the German left, which, by the way, emerged out of the former East German Communist Party, which then aligned with a political group that had split from the SPD, led by a man called Oskar Lafontaine, who was quite an important German politician, who's still alive, by the way. He still comes out. He's also, by the way, a critic of the war, but he's basically retired. He's very elderly. But anyway, she is a person who, very, very interestingly, is more of a populist in some respects than any other politician in Germany, in terms of the way you, Robert, use the phrase, in that she's working class. She has a working class pitch. She's against immigration. She's for strong welfare state intervention in the economy. She is fiercely anti-woke. She is, in other words, an old style, classical 1960s German social democrat. I mean, I don't know what her ultimate background is, but once upon a time, say in 1965, she would have been seen as completely mainstream in most of Europe. All these policies that I've just talked about, all these positions that she holds, including not wanting conflict with the Russians, wanting to pursue some kind of Ostpolitik policies with the Russians, the signature foreign policy of the SPD government in the 1960s and 70s. Well, that's what she stands for. Of course, nowadays, you know, as far as the mainstream media is concerned, this is utter heresy. She must be called every bad thing that you can possibly throw at her. But it's popular. I think I saw one opinion poll somewhere which said that 35% of Germans would, could imagine themselves voting for a party, a political movement that she leads. Now, that's an incredible position if she were to achieve it from a standing start. Realistically, perhaps she won't. But the very fact that she's there, that she's articulating these things, is inevitably going to start to have a major effect on Germany. And by the way, bear in mind, Germany is now in the early stages of an deindustrialization process, which is still reversible. But, you know, once that thing gains momentum, it becomes almost impossible to reverse. That is going to have a traumatic effect on the German social and political psychology. And I can very well easily see working class opinion in Germany solidifying behind a program and potentially a party like this. So this is an important thing. And, you know, she's left her old party, Die Linke, which has, by the way, gone all woke, just to say. It's a fact which most people don't know, but, you know, the former East German Communist Party has basically gone largely woke. Very strange, very extraordinary development. But anyway, she's breaking away from that. And, of course, she's taking a lot of the support of the AfD, the right party, with her. And the interesting thing there is that the AfD, which, you know, had a certain potential, in my opinion, but it never stabilized itself. It never developed a coherent leadership. It never, I mean, there's some very clever people in the AfD, but a lot of very odd people as well. And it never really sorted itself out. So again, I can understand why, when you have somebody, you know, clear-cut, straightforward figure like this appearing on the scene politically, that she's starting to attract support from that quarter as well. So I'm not saying this is an unstoppable force. It's far too early. And Germany is this intensely conformist place. I mean, people have a lot of trust in the political system in Germany. They have good reason to be afraid of doing things that are going to rock the boat politically too much. I mean, the history weighs on Germany very heavily. I know, Robert, that you watch Babylon Berlin, and, you know, the kind of politics that Germans remember from that time. So not easy to break through in some ways, but the political space for it is certainly there.
I think, you know, to wrap up, I know it's getting late over there in the continent. Just was going to answer one super chat about central bank digital currencies. You'll see it explored and experimented with by various countries around the globe, but their big plan of a global central bank digital currency that had a digital passport, that had, you know, social credit scores that could be attached to it, and all of that. That dream, that controlled dream that Tony Blair was talking about at Davos, that Bill Gates has been talking about for some time. That basically went away when they were unsuccessful in the war on Russia, because now most of the world has no interest in a central bank digital currency that could wipe them out overnight, like the U.S. tried to do to Russia and failed to do. You know, and I guess so that's good news on that front. It's going to be an issue, but it won't be at the global scale they wanted it to be, because they lost against Russia. And it looks like, you know, Victoria Nuland and the neocons' ultimate exit strategy is, you know, in terms of the dangers of waking up the bear, the Russian bear, is it's the old joke. You don't have to be faster than the bear. You just have to be faster than the other guy. And it looks like the other guy they're going to feed the bear is Zelensky.
Absolutely. Well, I don't know. I mean, I've been speaking a bit. Alex, do you want to step in?
Well, no. Let's wrap it up. That was 2.5 hours
Yeah.
of just awesome.
Yeah.
That was
Fantastic.
fantastic. Thank you very, very
Mm.
much. The great Robert Barnes. Once again, where can people find you?
Get all the content, including hush hushes of alternative views of history and current events at vivabarneslaw.locals.com.
Thank you very, very much, Robert. Thank you, Alexander. Thank you to all our moderators. Thank you to everyone that was watching us on all of the platforms. And I will have all of Robert's information down below in the description box and pinned as a comment, and we will answer all of the questions in a dedicated Q&A as well. Thank you, everybody. Take care.